Welcome in, everyone. If you're joining us today, you're probably looking for a sort of shortcut to being well-informed.
Right away to get those crucial nuggets of knowledge without feeling completely overwhelmed by just an avalanche of data.
Exactly. Because it is a lot.
Yeah.
But you are in the perfect place. I'm your host for today's deep dive, and I am so thrilled to have our resident expert here with me to unpack all of this.
Hi everyone. I am really glad to be here. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about.
Yeah, and today we are doing a deep dive into the fascinating world of child development. We're looking at a comprehensive set of chapter notes, specifically the source files, ch1dv sys2.pdf, and a brief excerpt from ch2dv sys2.pdf.
It's some really dense but incredible material.
It really is. And our mission today is to essentially unpack how humans grow, change, and learn over time. We'll be exploring everything from our deep evolutionary instincts to modern brain imaging,
We're even going to touch on the mathematical randomness of genetics later on.
which is wild. And I have to say, I absolutely love that you're joining us with that specific background today. You've got the old leather-bound philosophy books on one side, and then those glowing neural network maps on the other.
Yeah, I thought it was fitting.
It's the perfect visual metaphor for the journey we're taking today.
It really is, isn't it? Because we're bridging the gap between some of the earliest theories of human behavior and absolute cutting-edge neuroscience. But before we get into the weeds, let's just ground ourselves in what we're actually talking about here.
At the basics.
Exactly. When we say development, we're talking about the patterns of growth and change in our behavior, our thinking, and our emotions over time.
It's not just getting taller.
No, not at all. And to make sense of all that chaotic growth, researchers use theories, and I think people misuse that word a lot. A theory isn't just a random guess, it's a highly organized set of ideas designed to describe, explain, and eventually predict how we develop.
Those are like blueprints.
Yeah, we use them as frameworks, and then we go out and test those frameworks in the real world.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the very beginning. Our evolutionary roots.
Oh, yeah, the deep history.
Right. There's this whole branch of study called ethology that looks at how we adapt to our environment just to survive. Researchers actually go out and study animal and human behavior in natural settings.
Which is fascinating work.
It is. I was reading the notes on Konrad Lorenz and his famous discovery of imprinting in animals. That's where baby birds just automatically follow the first moving object they see.
Right, usually the mother, but sometimes a researcher's boots.
Exactly. And that simple observation led to this massive concept in human development called the sensitive period.
That's a crucial concept.
Basically, we have these specific windows of time where our brains are just biologically primed and wide open to pick up certain behaviors like language.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can really see how those deep biological drives shape our most important relationships. Look at John Bowlby's attachment theory. He was trying to figure out the infant-caregiver bond. A baby's behaviors, the smiling, the babbling, the grasping, and yes, the relentless crying, they aren't just cute quirks.
And the crying isn't just to annoy you.
Exactly. They are deeply ingrained evolutionary social signals. A baby is literally wired to deploy those behaviors to force a caregiver to pay attention and meet their physical and emotional needs.
So it's literally a survival mechanism.
100%. Bowlby argued that the success of that early attachment bond basically sets the trajectory for human relationships for the rest of that person's life.
That evolutionary perspective is just wild because it makes you look at completely normal, everyday human behavior as a survival tactic. Our notes bring up some really fascinating evolutionary puzzles, too.
Like what?
Well, for instance, why do children naturally tend to play in gender-segregated groups? Evolutionary psychology asks what they're actually learning from that kind of play that might translate into a health survival strategy.
Yeah, makes sense.
Or think about this. Why do human adults live for such a long time after their children are grown and out of the house?
Yeah.
Most animals don't do that. It completely shifts how you view the architecture of a human life.
It does. It forces you to ask why a behavior exists rather than just observing that it exists. But, if evolutionary theory is all about physical survival on the outside, we have to look at the other side of the coin.
Which brings us to the psychodynamic theories.
Right. This is a massive shift in perspective because here development is driven by internal psychological conflicts.
It's less about escaping a predator and more about what's going on in your head.
Exactly. The internal clash between your biological drives and the expectations of society. How you resolve those internal clashes is what shapes your personality.
Right, and you really can't talk about psychodynamic theories without bringing up Sigmund Freud.
You really can't.
Now, his specific psychosexual stage is the idea that kids go through oral, anal, phallic, and genital stages.
Yeah.
Most of that has been heavily criticized and largely thrown out by modern science.
Yeah, it just doesn't have the empirical data to back it up.
We don't need to memorize those stages.
Yeah.
But his core underlying idea was absolutely groundbreaking. He was really the first person to boldly claim that what happens to you in your earliest years of life permanently wires your adult personality.
That was a revolutionary concept at the time. And Erickson took that foundational idea and built a much more comprehensive model with his psychosocial theory.
And he didn't stop at childhood at all.
No, Erickson didn't think development stopped at childhood at all. He saw it as a lifelong journey. And instead of focusing on sexual drives, he focused on social and emotional conflicts that we have to resolve on a sort of positive-negative continuum.
Like what kind of conflicts?
Well, for example, in your very first year of life, the core conflict is basic trust versus mistrust. Your brain is just trying to figure out, is this world a safe place?
Oh, wow.
Then as a toddler, it becomes autonomy versus shame and doubt, realizing you're an independent person. He mapped these conflicts all the way to old age.
That's a huge scope.
It is. And while his theory is sometimes criticized for being a bit broad, it beautifully captures the universal socio-emotional hurdles we all face. Though he did note that how we clear those hurdles is highly dependent on our specific culture.
So if Erickson believed our internal emotional feelings shaped us, John Watson and the behaviorists looked at that and said, absolutely not.
Right. They went in a totally different direction.
They essentially threw internal feelings right out the window. This brings us to the learning theories. They argue that behavior is just the child's response to environmental stimuli.
Pure environment.
Yeah, I came across this quote from Watson in our notes, and honestly, it stopped me in my tracks. It's an incredibly bold way to look at human potential.
The dozen infants quote.
Yes, he basically said, give me a dozen healthy infants, and if I can control their world, I can guarantee to train any one of them to become any type of specialist. A doctor, a lawyer, or even a beggar and a thief.
It's intense.
He believed in the blank slate. No inherited talent, no genetic destiny, just pure environment.
It's a staggering claim, almost arrogant in a way. But look at the mechanics of how they believe this happened. You have Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning, which is basically learning by association.
Right, the famous dogs.
Exactly. If you pair something neutral with something scary enough times, pretty soon that neutral thing triggers a fear reflex automatically. Then B.F. Skinner comes along with operant conditioning, which is even simpler.
Rewards and punishments.
Yes. If a behavior gets rewarded, you'll do it again. If it gets punished, you'll stop. But eventually researchers realized that's a bit too robotic.
We aren't just machines.
Right. So Albert Bandura introduced social learning theory, arguing that kids don't need to be directly rewarded or punished to learn. They just watch what happens to other people.
That's where that famous Bobo doll experiment comes in, right?
That's the one.
The one where kids watched an adult beat up this large inflatable doll, and then when the kids were put in the room, they completely imitated that aggression.
Exactly. They mimicked it perfectly. But what's crucial is that Bandura eventually renamed his model the social cognitive learning theory.
Why the change?
He realized kids weren't just mindlessly copying what they saw. There was a thinking process involved. A child is more likely to imitate someone if they think that person is popular or smart, or if they see that person getting rewarded.
Oh, so they're evaluating it.
Yes. Most importantly, the child has to believe they can actually pull off the behavior themselves, a concept Bandura called self-efficacy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Enter Jean Piaget. He looked at that blank slate idea and completely rejected it.
Completely.
He didn't think kids were just empty vessels waiting to be conditioned by rewards or just mindlessly copying adults. He viewed children as active learners,
Yeah.
like little scientists.
I love that analogy.
Piaget said, children construct knowledge by creating schemes which are basically mental blueprints for how the world works. And they constantly run little experiments to test those blueprints.
Give us an example.
Think about a baby who bites into an apple and thinks, okay, fruit slices are sweet. That's their scheme. But the next day they bite into a lemon slice. Suddenly it's incredibly sour.
A rude awakening.
Right. They have to completely adjust their mental blueprint of the world to accommodate this new shocking information.
That's a perfect analogy. Piaget argued that this kind of understanding doesn't just grow steadily. It shifts in massive dramatic leaps at key ages, around 2-6 and early adolescence.
So it's not a smooth ramp, it's a staircase.
Exactly. A child physically and biologically unlocks new ways of thinking, moving from just grabbing and tasting things all the way up to abstract logic. Piaget's impact is hard to overstate. He inspired Montessori education and discovery-based play.
But he wasn't perfect.
No, he wasn't. He famously underestimated how smart infants actually are, and his tasks were heavily biased toward Western formal schooling. That's why Lev Vygotsky's sociocultural theory is such an important counterpoint.
What did Vygotsky say?
He argued that you can't separate cognitive development from social interaction. We don't learn in a vacuum. We learn because experts and adults guide us. And how they guide us depends entirely on culture.
So it's not just about what the brain can do, it's about how the community teaches the brain to do it.
Precisely. In Western cultures, we rely heavily on verbal instruction. We talk our kids through tying their shoes or solving a puzzle. But in many traditional cultures, learning relies much more on silent observation and physical demonstration.
Oh, that makes sense.
A child might learn to weave a complex basket just by watching an elder do it for months before ever trying it themselves. The cognitive development is happening, but the mechanism is totally different.
I love that contrast. Now, moving into a much more modern perspective, we have the information processing theories. These researchers look at human development and basically say, let's treat the brain like a computer.
The hardware and software approach?
Exactly. Our senses are the input and our memories are the hard drive and the mental hardware. The way we pay attention or solve problems is our mental software.
It's a very clean way to look at it.
It is. Under this analogy, a toddler is like a really clunky older desktop from the 90s. They have very little storage space, a super slow processor, and basic software. But as you grow, you don't necessarily jump through magical stages.
Right. No staircase here.
You just get continuous system upgrades. A teenager is like a modern supercomputer with massive memory capacity, lightning-fast processing speeds, and highly adaptable software.
And this is where my glowing neural network backdrop really comes into play.
I was wondering when we'd get to that.
When we look at developmental cognitive and social neuroscience, we aren't just using metaphors anymore. We are using functional brain imaging to actually watch these hardware upgrades happen in real time.
That is incredible.
We can literally see neural networks becoming more efficient. As a child ages, brain imaging shows that the activity required to solve a problem becomes increasingly specialized, often shifting to one specific hemisphere.
So the brain is physically reorganizing.
Yes. But it's not just about solving math puzzles. Social neuroscience blends this biology with our emotional lives. Researchers measure blood pressure, heart rates, and stress hormones in saliva to understand complex issues.
Like what?
They use this to figure out the neurobiological reasons behind why teenagers take so many risks, or to study the architecture of autism spectrum disorder. They can even see the tragic physical impact of extreme neglect.
Like what happens in deprived orphanages.
Exactly, how that lack of environmental input literally prunes away their brain's potential.
It's heavy stuff, but it beautifully illustrates the dominant contemporary view, which is developmental systems theories. This is the ultimate realization that absolutely everything is connected.
You can't separate any of it.
Right. You can't just study a kid's genetics or just their home life or just their school. None of it works in isolation.
Yuri Bronfenbrenner mapped this out brilliantly with his bioecological model.
Wow.
Picture the developing child at the center of a Russian nesting doll.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The innermost doll is the microsystem, the immediate family and friends. The next layer out is the mesosystem, which is how those immediate groups interact. For instance, does your family trust your school?
Makes sense.
Outside of that is the exosystem. These are forces the child never directly interacts with, but they still feel the ripple effects. A great example is a parent's workplace.
Oh, right. If a dad is incredibly stressed by his boss, he brings that stress home, and it fundamentally alters the child's environment.
Exactly. Then you have the macro system, the cultural values and laws of the country you live in. And wrapping around all of these dolls is the chronosystem, which accounts for the fact that all these layers are constantly shifting over time.
So if a child is caught in the middle of all these layers, genetics, stress, parents, cultural laws, how do all these wildly different factors actually interact in real time to produce a behavior?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's what dynamic systems theory, or DST, tries to answer. DST operates on the multi-causality principle, which is just a fancy way of saying there is no single boss.
No one factor is in charge.
Right. No one factor is the most important. But the coolest part is the self-organizing principle. Think of it like a teenager learning to drive a manual car.
Oh man, that is stressful.
Very. At first, it's totally chaotic. They are overwhelmed by the clutch, the gas, the mirrors, the traffic. The system is incredibly unstable.
Right, they're stalling out.
But eventually, the system reorganizes. The brain and body figure out the pattern, the skills click together, and suddenly driving becomes this smooth, highly complex, automatic behavior. Because everyone has unique genetics and unique environments, the final outcomes are always going to be highly variable, even if the general path looks similar.
Okay, so we've covered this massive landscape of ideas, from deep evolutionary survival tactics to little scientists tasting lemons all the way to neural networks and nesting dolls.
That's a lot of ground.
It is. But as a consumer of information, I have to ask, how do researchers actually know any of this is true? How do they test these theories without just guessing?
We have to talk about the research methods.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about the research methods. I know case studies are really popular. That's where you do a deep, intensive dive into one specific person. You interview them, observe them, take biophysical measurements.
Right, very in-depth.
Sometimes they study extreme cases like Jeannie the wild child who grew up in total isolation to understand what happens when development goes horribly wrong. Even Piaget used case studies on his own children.
He did.
The detail you get is incredible, but the obvious flaw is that studying one wild case doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the average kid.
What's fascinating here is how we study the average kid. That's usually through correlational research. This is where researchers just observe the world as it naturally is without interfering.
Just watching.
Yes. They take two variables and see if they associate with each other. We measure this with a correlation coefficient, usually just called R. Without getting too bogged down in the math, the number tells you how strong the relationship is, and the plus or minus sign tells you the direction.
Give us a real-world example.
So you might ask, is the amount of time a teenager spends scrolling on social media associated with a higher depression score? If both go up together, that's a positive correlation. But here's the trap everyone falls into. Finding that link does not mean the screen time caused the depression.
Right. It just shows they travel together.
Exactly.
Because it could be that being depressed makes you want to stay in bed and scroll more.
Yeah.
So if finding an association doesn't actually prove causation, how do researchers ever prove that X causes Y?
That's where they have to rely on the gold standard, the experimental design. This is the only way to confidently prove cause and effect.
How does it work?
The logic is strict but simple. You take a large group of children and randomly assign them to two groups. Because it's random, those two groups are essentially identical in makeup. Then you change one specific thing, the independent variable for only one of the groups. Let's say you have the experimental group watch a highly violent television show while the control group watches a completely neutral documentary. Afterwards, you measure their aggression levels. Because the groups started out identical and the only difference in their experience was the violent show, if the experimental group acts more aggressively, you can safely conclude that the show caused the behavior.
That makes perfect sense.
Oh.
But what about the fact that kids grow up? Studying development over time feels like you'd need a time machine. If you want to know how a 5-year-old changes by the time they're 15, how do you do that practically?
It's incredibly difficult. The most thorough way is a longitudinal study. You take a group of 5-year-olds today and you literally track them down every few years to test them again.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. It gives you amazing data on individual change, but it's wildly expensive. Researchers retire and participants drop out or move away. The shortcut is the cross-sectional study.
How is that different?
You just go to a school today and test a group of 5-year-olds, a group of 10-year-olds, and a group of 15-year-olds all in the same afternoon. It's fast and cheap.
But the catch there is the cohort effect, right? A 5-year-old today and a 15-year-old today didn't just grow up in different bodies. They grew up in fundamentally different eras.
Exactly. Think about a child who spent their crucial developmental years isolated during a global pandemic versus a 15-year-old who had a totally normal early childhood.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Or think about a kid today whose entire educational framework is being driven by generative AI compared to a kid just 10 years older. You aren't just comparing ages, you're comparing completely different historical experiences.
So how do they fix that?
Researchers try to blend these two methods to cancel out the flaws, but it gets complicated. They also use microgenetic designs, which is just intensely observing a kid over a few days right when they are on the brink of a new skill.
Like learning to walk.
Right, to catch the exact moment it clicks. And ethnographic methods, where a researcher actually moves in and lives with a cultural group to observe development from the inside out.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Take a second today to reflect on your own systems. Think about how your family dynamics, your microsystem, bumped up against the cultural laws of the decade you grew up in.
It's a great exercise.
Think about those early blueprints you built as a toddler, and how many times you had to rewrite them when life handed you a lemon instead of a sweet piece of fruit. Human development isn't just one neat, tidy narrative. It's a messy, beautiful collision.
It really is.
You are the product of deep evolutionary survival instincts, environmental conditioning, biological hardware upgrades, and the complex social software of your community. It's all interacting dynamically right now.
And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought drawn from a really profound little note in the excerpt from Chapter 2.
Let's hear it.
We spent this entire deep dive looking at how the environment, parenting, age, and biology shape a human after they are conceived. But the sources briefly touch on the concept of genetic variability in the sex cells themselves.
Okay.
Think about the sheer mathematical implications of that. Before the environment ever touches a child, before the brain forms a single neural network, or the first social interaction ever occurs, the mathematical randomness of genetic variability sets a completely unique, unrepeatable blueprint.
That is mind-blowing.
I invite you to mull over this today. If the biological deck is shuffled so infinitely before the game even begins, how much of our developmental journey is truly predictable by these theories, and how much is beautifully, wonderfully chaotic from the very first cell?
That is an incredible thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the messy reality of human development. We hope it gave you some aha moments to take with you into your own life. Keep questioning the world around you, and we will catch you next time. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive, created specifically for you. Today, we're setting out on a mission to explore what is arguably the most epic, hidden journey any of us will ever take.
It really is the ultimate origin story.
It totally is. We're talking about the incredible 38-week marathon that starts with a single microscopic cell and ends with a fully formed, crying, learning human newborn. We're going to explore the hidden world of prenatal development. And we're using a comprehensive academic lecture module as our primary source today.
Yeah, Chapter 3 specifically focusing on prenatal development.
Right. And our mission today is to distill this really dense developmental psychology material into the absolute most mind-blowing aha moments. We're going to skip the heavy jargon, but keep all the fascinating mechanics of how we actually came to be.
And the so what here is huge. By understanding these early stages, you gain a really profound appreciation for both the fragility and the sheer resilience of human biology. It shows us in vivid mechanical detail exactly how our environment begins shaping us before we even take our first breath.
Let's start right at the very beginning of that timeline, the germinal period. This covers weeks 0 through 2. After conception, you have this single fertilized egg called a zygote, and within days, it rapidly divides and transforms into something called a blastocyst.
And what's amazing here is that this tiny hollow ball of cells immediately starts organizing itself into highly specialized layers. The inner layer of cells, the embryonic disc, is what will eventually become the person. But the outer cells, called the trophoblast, have a completely different mission.
They act almost like a biological spacesuit.
Exactly like a spacesuit. It's the life support system. Those outer cells are going to form the amniotic sac, which cushions the developing organism, and the placenta, which acts as a highly sophisticated filtration and nutrient delivery system.
Wow.
But before any of that complex machinery can spin up, the blastocyst has to successfully implant itself into the uterine wall. And researchers have found a staggering statistic that really sets the stage for how miraculous this all is. Approximately 70% of zygotes do not successfully implant.
70%.
70%.
So right out of the gate, before the journey even truly begins, biology implements this massive filter.
Yeah, it perfectly illustrates the incredible odds of a successful pregnancy from the very starting line. The biological hurdles are massive. I mean, if the cellular division isn't perfect or the hormonal environment isn't exactly right, the process simply halts.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if that microscopic spacesuit does successfully implant, we move into the embryonic period. This spans weeks 3 through 8. And looking at the biological data, this is the most vulnerable period of development.
Without a doubt.
It's this critical window where all the major organs and body parts are established in their rudimentary forms. It's like pouring the foundation, laying the plumbing, and running the electrical wiring for a house all at the exact same time.
That's a great way to put it.
You have 3 primary layers. You have the ectoderm, which becomes the nervous system and skin. You have the mesoderm, which forms the muscles, skeleton, and circulatory system. And then the endoderm, which turns into the digestive system, lungs, urinary tract, and glands.
And the sheer speed of what happens next is just mind-boggling, particularly when you look at neurogenesis, which is the creation of neurons from that ectoderm layer. By week 5, neurons are developing at a rate of about 200,000 per minute.
200,000 new brain cells every 60 seconds. Trying to wrap your head around that kind of explosive cellular growth is almost impossible.
It is. And that rapid growth is exactly why medical professionals stress the critical importance of a pregnant person taking folic acid, which is a B-complex vitamin.
Because of the neural tube, right?
Yes,
Okay.
precisely. During this hyper-vulnerable window, the primitive spinal cord, the neural tube, is forming. It essentially folds over and zips up like a biological zipper. If that tube doesn't close properly during this massive growth phase, it can lead to severe structural issues like spina bifida. Folic acid is the necessary chemical fuel that helps ensure that zipper closes flawlessly.
That makes perfect sense of why prenatal vitamins are pushed so heavily. Now, as all of this foundational wiring and plumbing is being laid down, what is happening with sexual differentiation? Because I always assumed that was determined immediately at conception based on genetics.
Well, the genetics are determined at conception, yes, but the physical development is a completely different story. If you look at an embryo at 6 weeks, whether they are genetically XY for male or genetically XX for female, they possess completely identical internal genital structures.
Wait, really? There's zero physical difference between them at that point?
Zero. They all start with the exact same biological baseline.
So when does the divergence happen?
The biological switch doesn't flip until week 7. At that point, if the embryo is genetically male, a specific gene located on the Y chromosome called the SRY gene turns on. This gene triggers the production of testosterone.
And that changes the structures.
Right. That surge of testosterone causes the primitive female internal structures to wither away, and it directs the male structures to develop. In genetic females, the absence of that testosterone surge causes the male structures to degenerate, allowing the female reproductive system to mature.
Fascinating.
But the hormonal choreography here is incredibly fluid. There are exceptions, like complete androgen insensitivity. In these cases, a genetically male embryo cells are completely insensitive to the effects of testosterone.
So because the body can't hear the testosterone signal.
Exactly. It defaults to the baseline, which can actually result in the development of female external genitalia despite having XY chromosomes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. By the end of week 8, all those foundational structures are built. We then move into the fetal period, which runs from week 9 all the way to birth. The mission basically changes. It goes from building the parts to scaling them up.
Yeah, and the physical changes are dramatic. The fetus gets covered in this thick, white, cheese-like substance called vernix.
Which acts like a heavy waterproofing moisturizer.
It does. Think about it. If you soak in a bathtub for an hour, your skin prunes. Imagine soaking in amniotic fluid for months. The vernix protects the skin from chapping, and it's held in place by a downy hair called lanugo, which acts almost like biological Velcro.
That is such a brilliant piece of biological engineering.
Yeah.
And the growth numbers are staggering. The heartbeat becomes audible, and from week 20 to birth, the weight of the brain increases tenfold.
Tenfold. And what's fascinating here is the pivot from just physical growth to actual cognition. The womb isn't just a waiting room where the fetus sits dormant. It is an active classroom.
The sources mentioned evidence of fetal learning.
Yes, researchers have found clear, measurable evidence of it. By 30 weeks, fetuses demonstrate a psychological phenomenon called habituation.
Walk us through how we actually measure habituation in a fetus.
We measure it through biological reactions. If researchers introduce a new auditory stimulus, say a loud beep or a novel voice to a 30-week-old fetus, monitors show their heart rate and electrical brainwaves immediately spike. They are actively reacting to something new in their environment.
But if you keep playing that exact same sound over and over,
that biological response gradually declines. They get used to it. They habituate. Then, if you introduce a brand new sound, their heart rate and brainwaves shoot right back up.
proving mechanically that they can distinguish between new and original stimuli.
Exactly, which means they possess short-term memory.
Which connects directly to everyday life for you listening. Over those last 6 weeks in the womb, fetuses are actively listening and categorizing sounds. They learn to distinguish the specific tone and rhythm of their mother's voice compared to a stranger's voice.
They can even recognize the rhythmic patterns of their native language versus a foreign language.
Yeah, the classic cat in the hat studies noted in this source material show this perfectly. Fetuses showed a measurable preference for familiar melodies or specific stories that were read to them repeatedly while still in the womb. They're literally learning the cadence and culture of their family before they ever see them.
It completely shifts our perspective on what a fetus is capable of experiencing. But because they are so incredibly receptive to their environment, we also have to examine the more precarious side of prenatal influences.
Right. Which brings us to teratogens. A teratogen is defined clinically as any environmental agent that causes structural or functional damage during the prenatal period. This covers a wide range of things like certain medications, drugs, maternal diseases, and environmental hazards.
And it's important to note here.
Oh, just to be clear to you listening, our goal right now is simply to impartially report the medical mechanisms found in the research. We aren't passing moral judgment on substance use. We are focusing strictly on how these agents interact with human biology.
Absolutely. To understand how teratogens interact with a developing fetus, we have to look at four main principles. First is dose. Naturally, larger doses of an agent over longer periods generally produce more severe negative effects. Second is genetics. The unique genetic makeup of both the pregnant person and the fetus can make them more or less biologically vulnerable to a specific agent.
And third is cumulative effects.
Right. Simultaneous exposure to multiple teratogens compounds the biological stress. And finally, and perhaps most crucially, is timing.
Timing, meaning those sensitive periods we talked about earlier.
Precisely. The effect of the teratogen depends heavily on the exact age of the organism at the time of exposure. Think back to the house analogy. If a storm hits while you are laying the foundation or running the main electrical lines, like during that explosive neurogenesis phase, the structural damage is devastating.
But if the storm hits after the house is fully built and you're just painting the walls, the damage is much more superficial.
Exactly. The clinical data details several specific mechanisms, particularly regarding alcohol and cigarettes. Medical researchers note that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, is the leading non-genetic cause of developmental disability in Canada.
The biology of it is that alcohol actively interferes with neurogenesis and neural migration. It disrupts the way those newly minted brain cells travel to their proper locations, which can lead to reduced overall brain size and distinct physical changes.
And the mechanical data on cigarettes is equally stark. Nicotine specifically restricts blood vessels. When blood vessels constrict, it inhibits the flow of oxygen and vital nutrients through the placenta to the fetus.
Functioning a bit like pinching a garden hose.
That's a perfect visualization. This restricted flow can lead to low birth weight, premature birth, and researchers have even noted that smoking can alter the embryo's epigenetic profile.
And we also have to look beyond intentionally consumed substances. Researchers conducting environmental hazard studies analyzed the blood from the umbilical cords of 10 randomly selected newborns. They were looking for industrial chemicals.
And what they found is alarming. They found 287 different types of industrial contaminants, including pesticides and consumer product chemicals.
Meaning, due to modern environmental pollution, many babies are practically born polluted by chemicals that can potentially impair complex cellular development.
It's a very sobering picture of the modern womb.
It really is. But it also usually frames this entire conversation exclusively around the mother's body and environment. I want to ask, is it all on the pregnant person? What about the father's biological role in this equation?
This raises an important question, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the data on paternal factors is incredibly revealing. It is definitely not all on the mother. For instance, statistical research shows that older fathers have a measurably increased risk of having offspring with conditions like schizophrenia or autism spectrum disorder.
What is the mechanical reason for that?
It comes down to what biologists call de novo mutations. These are spontaneous genetic errors. Unlike a female who is born with all the eggs she will ever have, a male is constantly producing new sperm throughout his life.
So cells are constantly dividing and copying DNA.
Exactly. As a man ages, that cellular copy machine gets older and a bit less precise. Spontaneous genetic errors become more frequent in the sperm, and those errors are passed directly into the blueprint of the embryo.
But the research goes even further than just the age of the copy machine. I was blown away by the historical data on diet.
Oh, yes. This is where the science of epigenetics completely rewrites how we think about inheritance. Researchers analyzed historical food availability records spanning 150 years in isolated populations.
And what did they find?
They found that a young boy's overnutrition, meaning having an excessively high-calorie diet or too much food, in the years just prior to his own puberty is directly linked to higher risks of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and early death in his sons and his grandsons.
His grandsons. You are saying a teenager's diet impacts a child born 2 generations later.
That's exactly what the data shows. The diet of that young boy chemically alters the epigenetic switches that regulate how genes are expressed on his Y chromosome. He doesn't change the underlying DNA code, but he changes which parts of the code are turned on or off.
And those specific epigenetic alterations are packaged into his sperm and
Right.
passed down through multiple generations.
It's incredible.
That is just unbelievable. And it's a perfect bridge into the next major concept we need to hit, the genetic lottery and how we monitor it. We just talked about those de novo or spontaneous mutations. There is a common misconception that inherited diseases are always passed down through recessive alleles, meaning you have to inherit a flawed copy of a gene from both parents.
But the data shows that between 75 and 80% of achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism, does not come from inherited recessive genes. It actually results from a brand new, spontaneous de novo mutation of a single gene on chromosome 4 during conception.
Furthermore, when we step back and look at the sheer astronomical complexity of millions of cells dividing and genetic codes unzipping and copying, it is a system inherently prone to errors.
Yes, biologists estimate that between 70 and 80% of all pregnancies actually result in miscarriage, usually very early on.
Wow.
About half of those are due to severe, incompatible chromosomal abnormalities. It is essentially biology's built-in filter halting development when complex life-sustaining systems are fundamentally compromised.
Which brings us to how modern medicine monitors this incredibly complex, fragile process today. The standard approach involves sophisticated testing, specifically the triple screen test, usually performed between 15 and 20 weeks.
This is a maternal blood test that measures 3 highly specific biological markers: AFP, which is a protein produced by the fetal liver, HCG, a hormone produced by the placenta, and estriol, an estrogen produced by both the fetus and placenta.
And the mechanics of why doctors look at those specific markers is fascinating. For example, if the neural tube we discussed earlier hasn't zipped up properly, AFP from the fetus leaks out into the amniotic fluid and crosses into the mother's bloodstream.
So an elevated AFP level is a mechanical indicator that there might be a neural tube defect. Conversely, a low AFP combined with abnormal levels of HCG and estriol provides a chemical signature that could indicate a chromosomal abnormality, like Down syndrome.
But having the technology to monitor these markers is only half the battle. We have to ask, is this care universally accessible?
Unfortunately, no. And the data from Canada provides a stark example of these disparities. Remote and reserve populations have more than double the infant mortality rate of the general Canadian population.
There's a massive disparity.
It is, and this isn't a biological difference, it is a structural one, driven by limited access to consistent, high-quality maternal prenatal care.
Though researchers do highlight successful interventions that prove how solvable this is, they point specifically to the Inuit midwifery service in northern Quebec.
Right. By returning birth to the community and providing culturally sensitive, locally accessible, and medically safe care, they drastically improved outcomes. It proves that targeted, community-based medical support changes the biological results.
It's a vital reminder that prenatal development doesn't happen in a sterile vacuum. It happens within a complex socioeconomic reality. So what does this all mean? We have navigated the explosive cellular growth, the teratogens, the environmental monitoring. We have finally reached the finish line. Birth.
I want to ask you, listening to this, who do you think actually triggers the labor process? Do you think it's the pregnant person's body finally deciding there is no more room?
It is one of the greatest biological plot twists, and the answer almost always surprises people. The signal to initiate labor actually comes from the fetal brain.
The baby triggers it.
Yes. When the fetal brain reaches a specific point of maturation, it triggers a release of hormones, specifically cortisol. That fetal cortisol travels through the placenta and acts as a chemical messenger, signaling the pregnant person's body to start producing oxytocin.
And it is the oxytocin that provokes the uterine muscles to begin contracting.
The baby literally knocks on the door when its brain is ready. That is brilliant. The baby sends the biochemical text message, and labor begins. And mechanically, this happens in 3 distinct stages. First is the dilation of the cervix. This is the longest phase, where those oxytocin-driven uterine contractions physically pull and thin the cervix until it opens to 10 centimeters, creating a pathway.
The second stage is the actual birth, where the baby is pushed through the vaginal canal and takes that dramatic first breath, shifting from fluid-based oxygen to breathing air.
And the third stage is the separation and delivery of the placenta. The biological spacesuit has done its job and is discarded.
The clinical data also note significant trends in how we manage this process today. There is a notable steady rise in cesarean sections across North America. This is driven by a complex mix of factors, including older maternal age, an increase in multiple births, and a generally more cautious medical approach to fetal distress.
And as for pain management, epidurals are the most widely used intervention. The medical consensus is that they are highly safe and effectively block pain signals without negative impacts on the newborn's biology, though they can occasionally slow down the mechanical pushing phase of labor.
And the minute that baby arrives, the medical team immediately begins a rapid biological assessment. This is where the APGAR scale comes in, used at exactly 1 minute and 5 minutes after birth.
APGAR is actually an acronym used to systematically check the newborn's critical systems, right?
It is. It stands for appearance, which is looking for healthy skin color, indicating good oxygenation. Pulse, verifying a strong heart rate. Grimace, which tests reflex irritability, essentially. Does the baby react when stimulated?
Right.
Activity, assessing strong muscle tone rather than limpness. And respiration, looking for a robust, crying, breathing effort.
Each of those 5 vital signs gets a score of 0, 1, or 2. If a baby has a total score of 7 or above at the 5-minute mark, their biological systems have successfully transitioned to the outside world.
A score below 7 means they are struggling and need specialized support, and anything below 4 requires immediate emergency medical resuscitation.
And while a full-term 40-week birth is the biological ideal, the reality is that roughly 12% of births are preterm, meaning they occur before 37 weeks. These early arrivals face massive physiological hurdles.
Because their complex systems, especially the lungs, immune system, and digestive tract, simply haven't had enough time to scale up and mature.
To support these premature babies, medical professionals utilize a fascinating, low-tech but highly effective intervention called kangaroo care. This involves taking the premature infant out of the incubator and placing them in bare skin-to-skin contact against the mother or father's chest for up to 3 hours a day.
And the biological response is astounding. Compared to standard incubator care, kangaroo care actively promotes increased weight gain, stabilizes heart rates, reduces irritability, and fosters much stronger neuroattachment.
It makes complete biological sense. You are essentially replicating the sensory environment of the womb, the rhythm of the parent's breathing, the steady thumping of the heartbeat, the regulation of body temperature.
It provides the precise external scaffolding the infant's nervous system needs to finish developing. It perfectly ties together everything we've discussed today. The biology of a human being is fundamentally driven by its environment and connection from day one.
It really does. So let's step back and summarize the sheer magnitude of the hidden world we've just explored. We traced a journey that starts with a high-risk cellular implantation, navigating a massive biological filter where 70% of zygotes don't make it.
We watched 200,000 brain cells fire into existence every single minute.
We explored how a 30-week-old fetus is actively habituating to sounds, learning the exact cadence of its family's language, and preparing for the outside world.
And we saw how exquisitely sensitive this entire process is to both the necessary nutrients and the modern pollutants it encounters.
For you, the listener, understanding these mechanics completely reframes our grasp of human biology. It shows us just how early and how profoundly our physical environments write the script for who we become.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on those incredible revelations we discussed regarding epigenetics and multigenerational data. Consider this. If environmental factors like industrial pollution, maternal stress, and even a grandfather's adolescent diet can fundamentally alter the epigenetic switches of future offspring.
Wow.
How much of your own physical and mental baseline was written into your biology decades before you were even conceived? It challenges our entire concept of when our personal timeline actually begins.
What a phenomenal question to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time. Welcome, everyone. Pull up a chair and get comfortable, because you are actually the most important person in the room right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to have you here.
Today, we are going on a deep dive, and our mission is to extract the absolute most fascinating, mind-blowing nuggets of knowledge from, well, a pretty intimidating stack of developmental psychology notes.
It is a massive stack of research, to say the least.
Right. And we are talking about infant growth, the five senses, and how the human brain actually wires itself from day one.
Which is fundamentally the story of how you and everyone you know became who you are. I mean, the mechanics of human development are incredibly intricate.
They really are. And I promise you, we are going to cure your information overload today. We are skipping the heavy academic jargon and jumping straight into the aha moment.
Which are everywhere in this data.
Everywhere.
Huh?
I'm talking about the surprising reasons why babies will actually reach for a toy with their feet a full month before they use their hands, or why those so-called genius-building Beatty DVDs might actually be doing the exact opposite of what they claim.
The contrast between what we assume about human development as a society and what the research actually reveals is consistently surprising.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with what we might call the human factory settings. When a newborn arrives, they aren't just a blank slate, right? They come preloaded with a rich set of reflexes.
Right, they absolutely do.
Now, some of these seem purely for survival. I know crying is a big one, and we will get to that in a second because the stats on that are wild. But I saw the term rooting mentioned constantly in the early developmental stages. Can you break down what that actually looks like?
Certainly. Rooting is a foundational survival reflex. If you gently stroke a newborn's cheek, they will automatically turn their head in that direction and open their mouth.
Like they're hunting.
They are essentially hunting for a food source. Without that built-in reflex, early feeding would be incredibly difficult.
That makes total sense. But then there's an entire category of reflexes that frankly seem kind of useless for a modern baby. Like, why do they have a stepping reflex?
Right, the stepping reflex.
Yeah, if you hold a newborn upright with their feet touching a table, they make alternating walking motions. But they are months and months away from actually being able to walk.
It does seem counterintuitive, but these reflexes give us an incredible window into our evolutionary past. Take the Moro reflex, for instance.
Oh, the embracing one.
Yes, if a baby hears a loud, sudden noise, or if they feel a sudden loss of support, like their head is falling backward, they will suddenly throw their arms out wide and then bring them inward, as if they are intensely embracing something.
Like they're trying to grab a hold of a parent.
Exactly. From an evolutionary perspective, for early primates and our ancestors, an infant who could instinctively cling to a moving mother had a much higher chance of survival.
Wow.
And the palmar grasp is another holdover. In the first week of life, a baby's grip is so strong they can almost support their own body weight.
That is wild.
But for a modern pediatrician, the presence of these reflexes at birth and the fact that they naturally disappear within the first 2 to 6 months are vital indicators. It tells the doctors that the infant's central nervous system is healthy and maturing on schedule.
Which brings us back to the most powerful survival reflex of all, which is the cry. I think most people just view it as a loud, frustrating noise, but the research frames it as a highly sophisticated alarm system. The data notes that babies average 1.5 to 2 hours of crying a day.
Which is a lot of crying.
It is. How is that functionally changing the environment around them?
Well, crying is an infant's very first form of interpersonal communication. And it doesn't just annoy people into paying attention, it physically alters the biology of the adults in the room.
Physically alters it.
Yes.
Oh.
When a mother hears her baby cry, it triggers an immediate release of oxytocin and prolactin in her brain. This literally stimulates what is called the letdown reflex, allowing breast milk to flow.
So the baby's cry basically operates a remote control for the mother's biology.
That's a great way to put it. But it's not just mothers. Males also experience a measurable release of hormones, including testosterone, when holding a crying infant. It's thought to be an adaptive physiological response to help them mobilize and deal with the stressful situation.
And the research on how our brains respond to the sound of a cry is just wild. I was reading about this study on mind wandering. Basically, researchers looked at what happens when adults are just zoning out, daydreaming.
Yes, the attention shift study.
Right. When they played the sound of a hunger cry, females, regardless of whether they were parents themselves or not, would automatically and immediately shift their attention out of that mind-wandering state. But males didn't show that same automatic, hardwired attention shift.
It perfectly illustrates how specialized our sensory and neural responses are. And that biological wiring extends directly into how a newborn's own senses function. They aren't just miniature adult senses. They are highly specialized tools for exactly what the infant needs at that specific moment in time.
Now, wait, I have to push back on that a little, because looking at the data on newborn vision, it seems incredibly flawed. What an adult with normal vision can see clearly at 600 feet, a newborn can only see clearly at 20 feet. Everything past that is just a massive, muddy blur. Isn't that a huge evolutionary disadvantage?
You would think so, but it's actually an adaptive brilliance. While their distance vision is practically non-existent, their focus is sharpest at exactly 8 to 12 inches away from their face.
Oh, which is the exact distance to the face of the person holding and feeding them.
Precisely. The infant's visual world is biologically narrowed to prioritize the absolute most important thing for their survival, which is their caregiver. They don't need to process the tree 600 feet away. They need to process the facial expressions of the person keeping them alive.
That is amazing. And while their vision is blurry, their taste and smell seem to be incredibly dialed in right out of the gate. They have a massive sweet tooth from day one, which obviously tracks, since breast milk is naturally sweet. But I was fascinated by the scent recognition.
Yes, newborns show a strong, immediate preference for the smell of their own mother's amniotic fluid and breast milk. If you place a breastfed baby between a pad with their mother's scent and a pad with a stranger's scent, they will consistently orient toward their mother.
That's incredible.
Interestingly, though, longitudinal observations show that bottle-fed babies don't recognize their mother's specific scent in quite the same rapid way.
It goes even deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
Because they're learning these preferences before they even enter the world. Can you explain that French study with the anise?
That is a wonderful example. Anise has a very strong, distinct black licorice flavor and aroma. Researchers in France observed mothers who consumed a lot of anise during the late stages of their pregnancy.
Right.
When their infants were born, researchers presented them with the scent of anise and observed their facial expressions. Those infants actually showed a distinct preference and positive reaction to that smell, whereas babies whose mothers didn't consume it reacted with neutrality or aversion.
They already knew what they liked.
Furthermore, infants can even learn to like bitter tastes, which human biology naturally rejects as a poison warning, if that bitter taste is consistently paired with the relief of hunger.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is that when you look at all this sensory data together, you see that infants are born uniquely prepared for language and social interaction. They inherently prefer the frequency range of the human voice. They prefer complex sounds over pure single tones.
Yeah, the auditory data is crazy.
Yeah.
By just 1 month old, they can distinguish between incredibly similar consonant sounds like ba and ga. And by 4.5 months, they can already pick their own name out of a stream of conversation.
It's amazing how their brains are absorbing all this visual and auditory data, but building that much neural architecture requires an enormous amount of physical energy.
Which brings us to how we actually fuel this incredible machine. Because if there are two topics in early development that come with an absolute overload of intense opinions and anxiety for parents, it's sleep and nutrition. Let's look at infant sleep first.
Always a heavily debated topic.
Always. There is a huge divide over co-sleeping. Here in the West, we constantly hear strong warnings from medical associations against co-sleeping or bed sharing because of the risks of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. But the notes suggest this isn't the global norm.
It is entirely not the global norm. This is a perfect area to just look objectively at what the research actually tells us, stripping away the cultural biases. We are simply reporting the findings from the developmental data here. Co-sleeping is actually the traditional normative practice for roughly 90% of the world's population, particularly across many Asian and African cultures.
So if it's that common globally, what are the actual safety parameters researchers look at when evaluating the risks?
The safety parameters are extremely specific. Longitudinal studies demonstrate that co-sleeping is safe for low-risk full-term infants, but only provided strict environmental precautions are met.
Such as?
The risk factors for infant death while co-sleeping involve hazards like the use of a soft surface, such as a padded mattress, a couch, or a waterbed. The risks skyrocket if parents smoke or use alcohol or drugs, which impairs their natural arousal responses. Heavy quilts and overclothing the infant also present major hazards.
Right.
But if an infant is sleeping on a firm, hard mattress next to a parent, in the absence of those specific hazards, recent studies show no increased risk of SIDS for low-risk babies older than 3 months.
And researchers look at SIDS through something called the triple risk model, right?
Hmm.
It shifts the perspective from SIDS being just one random, terrifying event to a very specific convergence of factors. Can you break that down?
The triple risk model is crucial for understanding this. It posits that SIDS usually requires the simultaneous intersection of three things. First, underlying genetic factors or subtle brain abnormalities that affect an infant's breathing control or arousal. Second, a vulnerable developmental age window, typically between 2 to 4 months, when an infant's reflexes and sleep patterns are undergoing massive transitions. And third, environmental stressors like overheating, stomach sleeping, or exposure to secondhand smoke. Take away one of those three, and the risk drops precipitously.
It is the intersection of biology, development, and environment. And we see that same complex intersection when we look at the data on infant nutrition. The age-old breast is best debate.
Yes.
Again, keeping our focus strictly on the impartial data provided by these developmental studies, there are massive claims about the short-term benefits of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. What do the actual numbers say?
The short-term physical benefits are staggeringly clear in the documentation. Exclusively breastfed babies see massive drops in respiratory and gastrointestinal infections. The data shows a 64 to 72% reduction in those infections.
That's huge.
Allergies drop by about 27%. The rate of ear infections gets cut completely in half. And there's a significantly reduced rate of SIDs and serious intestinal diseases.
Okay, so the short-term physical benefits are locked in, but the long-term cognitive benefits seem a lot more fiercely debated. I was reading about a specific finding linking breastfeeding to an increase in IQ scores.
Yes, this is where developmental research requires deep critical thinking. There is a highly publicized finding that breastfeeding might be linked to an average 3.5-point increase in IQ scores for children around 3 to 4 years old.
Okay.
The biological theory is that this is due to the high concentration of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, or LCPUFA, which are naturally found in breast milk and are vital for brain growth.
But a 3.5-point IQ difference sounds great on a headline. How does that actually hold up when you look at the real-world families participating in these studies?
I encourage you to consider the confounding factors here. In many modern societies, the ability to exclusively breastfeed for 6 full months is strongly correlated with a family's socioeconomic status. It correlates with higher parental income, more advanced parental education, better access to regular medical care, and often a different overall parenting style with more time for direct interaction.
Right. So the critical question researchers must ask is whether that 3.5-point IQ bump is truly coming from the fatty acids in the milk, or is it coming from the socioeconomic advantages that allowed the parent the time and resources to breastfeed in the first place.
That is such a vital distinction.
And furthermore, we have to remember a golden rule of research. Statistical significance does not equal practical significance. A 3.5-point difference on an IQ test might be statistically measurable across a massive population of thousands of children, but it makes virtually no practical, observable difference in a single child's actual life trajectory or daily cognitive function.
It's so easy to obsess over a few IQ points, but when you look at how the brain is actually wiring itself in those early years, the scale of what's happening dwarfs a simple test score. Let's talk about this explosive growth, because the physical hardware being built is staggering. It truly is. At birth, an infant has about 100 billion neurons. By age 2, the brain has already reached 80% of its adult weight. But it's not just growing bigger in mass, it's frantically wiring itself together. This process is called synaptogenesis.
The sheer volume of this wiring is hard to comprehend. I saw the stat on how many connections they make, and it blew my mind.
By 18 months of age, an infant's brain has created 50% more synaptic connections than are found in a fully mature adult brain.
The 50% more. So they just keep all those extra connections. It seems incredibly inefficient to build a highway system with twice as many roads as you actually need.
You're exactly right. It is inefficient. An optimal brain isn't one with the most connections. It's one with the fastest, most useful connections. So after this massive explosion of growth, the brain starts a ruthless process of pruning. Based entirely on what the infant is experiencing, up to 40 to 50% of those unused synapses are just cleared out. It is a strict biological use-it-or-lose-it system.
Use it or lose it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where developmental psychology makes a really important distinction between two types of brain development. The first is experience-expectant development.
Okay.
The infant brain is evolutionarily pre-wired to expect normal, everyday human experiences. It expects to see varying patterns of light. It expects to be held and cuddled. It expects to hear a language being spoken. When those basic experiences happen, the synapses are utilized and the brain permanently locks them in.
And the second type is experience-dependent development, which is more about unique skills, right?
Yes, experience-dependent development relies on specific, unique experiences that vary entirely from person to person. For example, if a child spends years diligently learning to play the violin, the somatosensory cortex in their brain, specifically the area mapping the fingers on their left hand, will actually grow larger and more dense. That structural growth is entirely dependent on their unique experience.
Think about the room you're in right now as you listen to this. If you were an 18-month-old, your brain would be furiously building and pruning connections based on the sounds in your room, the language we're speaking. It's literally building the hardware based on the software it's running. But what happens when the brain doesn't get those basic, expected experiences? The research brings up a very solemn historical example: the studies of Romanian orphans.
It is one of the most sobering periods in developmental psychology. Following the fall of the regime in Romania, researchers discovered state-run institutions filled with infants who were entirely deprived of normal human contact. The nurseries were profoundly silent. These children were completely lacking in normal social interaction, holding, and visual stimulation.
And the neurological impact of that deprivation was profound, wasn't it?
It was. But what these studies revealed to the scientific community is the concept of a critical window of opportunity, or a sensitive period in brain development. Children who were adopted out of that severe deprivation before they reached 6 months of age showed remarkable cognitive catch-up. Their brains were still plastic enough to recover and build the expected pathways.
But for the children adopted after that 6-month window.
The outcomes were fundamentally altered. While they certainly showed some improvement in loving homes, they generally suffered lasting cognitive impairments. When researchers looked at their brain scans, specifically PE and MRI scans, they actually saw a physical decrease in the overall size and metabolic activity of their cerebral cortex.
Wow.
This was particularly evident in the prefrontal cortex, which governs emotional control and complex decision-making. If the brain doesn't receive the input it expects during that critical window, the connections are pruned away and the foundation is permanently altered.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if extreme deprivation harms the brain, the logical leap a lot of companies made in the late 90s and early 2000s was, hey, maybe hyperstimulation will create a superbrain.
Ah, yes, the genius building trend.
Exactly. This was the whole premise behind those infant training programs and flashcard DVDs, like the famous Baby Einstein Empire. The marketing promised that if you pumped your baby full of classical music and rapid-fire visual information during that synaptogenesis phase, you'd guarantee a genius. Did that hyperstimulation actually work?
It was an incredibly compelling marketing pitch that tapped right into parental anxiety, but the long-term research completely dismantled it. Longitudinal studies that monitored hundreds of children over time found that not only did these programs fail to enhance cognitive development, they actually hindered it in measurable ways.
Let me ask you about the vocabulary numbers on that, because they are shocking.
They are. The data revealed that for every single hour spent in front of one of these screens, babies between 8 and 16 months old actually learned 6 to 8 fewer words than babies who were not watching the videos at all.
Fewer words.
Yes. It was so conclusive that the company eventually had to offer parents full refunds after facing intense legal challenges about their educational claims.
That just blows my mind. You try to hack the system and it backfires completely.
It perfectly illustrates that you cannot hack human development by skipping steps. Overwhelming an infant with expectations or artificial inputs that are far beyond their biological processing capacities doesn't accelerate development. It actively interferes with it.
Right?
A normal, slightly messy environment being talked to while folding laundry, playing with simple, age-appropriate toys, physically exploring a room is exactly the rich, multisensory data the brain expects and needs to wire itself perfectly.
Which brings us to how babies actually explore that room. Because physical movement is a huge part of this puzzle. Now, the classic old-school theory of motor development basically said that babies learn to reach, sit, crawl, and walk purely based on a biological clock.
The maturational view.
Right. The idea was that their brain simply matures, their muscles get bigger, and boom, a switch flips and they walk. But that's not how it works at all, is it?
No, the modern, widely accepted view is much more complex. It's called dynamic systems theory. It argues that a motor skill isn't just a software program downloading from the brain on a set schedule. It is an active, self-organizing system that depends on four interconnected elements: the maturation of the central nervous system, the physical capacity and proportions of the body, the child's own personal goals, and the support of the environment. All of these have to align.
And the best example of this, my absolute favorite fun fact from this entire stack of notes, is about reaching. I always assumed babies reached with their hands first.
The logical assumption.
But the data says if you take an 8-week-old baby and suspend them in the air over an interesting toy, they will actively try to reach for it with their feet. And they won't successfully reach for it with their hands until they are about 12 weeks old, a full month later. Wait, why feet?
It beautifully illustrates dynamic systems theory. The baby has the goal. They see the toy and they want to interact with it, but you have to look at their physical capacity.
Okay.
The joints in a baby's legs, specifically the hips and knees, are mechanically much simpler and easier to control than the highly complex multi-directional joints of the shoulder, elbow, and wrist. The arms are simply too complicated to manage at 8 weeks, so the baby uses whatever physical capacity is easiest to manage at that exact moment to achieve their goal.
They are little problem solvers. And they apply that same fierce determination to walking. We all know babies fall a lot when they learn to walk, and they have those hilarious, awkward gaits. The notes actually call early walkers Charlie Chaplin walkers because their feet are played out so wide for balance, and then they progress to the Frankenstein walk, stiff-legged and lurching forward like tiny, determined zombies.
It's a very accurate description.
But the actual physical effort they put into mastering this is unbelievable. What are the actual numbers on their practice sessions?
The amount of practice is truly a marathon. Researchers tracking toddlers found that a child actively practicing walking will take roughly 14,000 steps a day.
14,000. That's the equivalent of walking the length of 46 football fields every single day.
And in the process of taking those steps, they will fall down an average of 100 times a day. But the psychological reward, the faster mobility, the totally new visual perspective of the room, and the greater access to exploring their environment drives them to keep integrating their balance, muscle strength, and visual cues until the entire dynamic system works seamlessly.
But the environment plays a huge role in when that system comes together, right? Because different cultures treat motor development completely differently.
Absolutely. The environment can either aggressively accelerate or delay these physical milestones. For example, in Kenya, mothers in the Kipsigis community actively practice formal exercises to stimulate their infants' mobility.
Also,
They will dig specifically designed shallow holes in the ground and support the babies inside them with rolled blankets to safely encourage early sitting and standing postures. Because of this intense environmental support, these infants often skip the crawling phase entirely and walk much earlier than Western babies.
contrast that with rural northeastern China. The notes describe a traditional practice there that involves placing infants on their backs inside bags of fine sand. Basically an early diapering method to keep them safe, clean, and warm while the mothers work long hours in the fields. Because they simply aren't getting the floor time to practice bearing weight or balancing, those babies show significant delays in hitting sitting and walking milestones. It just goes to show the biological clock isn't the only thing ticking. The environment dictates the outcome.
And the environment also shapes how they perceive danger in that environment. This is wonderfully demonstrated by the famous visual cliff experiments.
Oh, this is fascinating.
To set the scene, imagine a sturdy table with a clear glass top. Right under the glass on one half of the table is a high-contrast checkerboard pattern. But on the other half of the table, that same checkerboard pattern is placed on the floor far below, creating the intense visual illusion of a steep cliff drop-off.
Now, according to the sensory data, a baby's depth perception, their stereopsis, is fully developed by about 3.5 months. So they can physically see that massive drop-off. But here's the kicker. They aren't naturally afraid of it.
Not at all.
If you put a newly crawling baby on the edge, they will happily and obliviously just crawl right out over the illusion of the cliff onto the clear glass.
This raises an important question. How do they learn the fear of heights? How do they eventually learn not to just pitch themselves headfirst down a flight of stairs?
I would guess it's not just a switch that flips in the brain. They need experience.
Exactly right. They need to physically crawl through their environment to experience something called optic flow, which are the visual cues that rush past your peripheral vision when you move yourself through space. They have to neurologically learn how their physical body movement relates to the visual depth they are seeing.
And the way researchers proved this is probably my favorite study of all.
Yeah.
They took babies who hadn't quite started crawling yet, and they put them in these little customized motorized go-karts.
Yes, the go-kart study.
The babies could control them with a little joystick, driving themselves around the room, experiencing that rush of optic flow without actually using their own muscles to crawl. And when they finally put those go-kart babies on the visual cliff, their heart rates accelerated. They showed a measurable fear response.
It's incredible.
Just the experience of driving the cart and seeing the world move past them wired their brain to understand the danger of the cliff.
It is the ultimate proof that action and perception are deeply intertwined. You cannot separate the brain's cognitive development from the physical experiences of the body.
So what does this all mean? What does all this dense science, these visual cliffs and Romanian orphanages and 14,000 daily steps mean for you listening right now?
Well, it proves that human development isn't just a biological checklist that automatically ticks off as you get older. It's a dynamic, deeply interactive dance.
Very true.
We are literally molded by our surroundings, by the sensory inputs we receive, and by our social connections from the exact second we are born. Every hug, every fall, every visual cue physically shapes the hardwiring of our minds.
And while it's easy to look at this developmental research and think of it as just a story about babies, I want to leave you with a final concept to mull over on your own. We've just discussed how an infant's brain aggressively prunes up to 50% of its synaptic connections based purely on what it doesn't use in its environment.
Right. Now, it's true that our brains are much less plastic as adults, but neuroplasticity never truly stops. The adult brain is always adapting. So ask yourself, based on your daily routines, your screen time, and your social interactions today, what parts of your own mind are you actively wiring right now, and what brilliant, unused connections are you quietly allowing your brain to prune away?
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're jumping straight into a really fascinating piece of source material today. It's a comprehensive chapter on developmental psychology, specifically focusing on the exact mechanics of how infant cognition and language develop. It's based on this document, H5DVV Psych2.pdf. And I mean, it is packed.
It really is. And, we tend to look at infants as just passive, kind of helpless creatures. They sleep, they eat, they cry. We often assume the world is just washing over them while they basically wait to grow up.
Right, like they're just loading.
Exactly. But the research we are dissecting today completely shatters that illusion.
It really does. I can promise you by the end of this deep dive, you will understand why babies are actually tiny mathematical mind-reading scientists. We will even get into the mechanics of how a 5-month-old can perform basic arithmetic.
Which is wild to even think about.
It's completely wild. But to figure out how we know any of this, we need to start with the foundational theories of Jean Piaget, who completely reframed how we look at the infant mind.
Yeah. Piaget shifted the entire field of cognitive development because he operated on a really radical assumption. He said babies are little experimenters. They aren't just absorbing their environment like sponges. They are actively and relentlessly constructing their own reality through direct physical interaction with the world around them.
Okay, let's unpack this because Piaget uses a very specific framework for how a baby organizes all of this environmental data. He called them schemes.
Right, schemes or schemas.
Yeah. And you can think of a scheme as a psychological blueprint or like a file folder. For an infant, these aren't abstract philosophical thoughts. They are purely sensor-motor option patterns. A baby's scheme for a wooden block isn't, a geometrical cube.
Right.
It's a thing I can grasp, thing I can bang on the table, thing I can chew on.
Exactly. And those schemes have to evolve constantly, and that happens through a process called adaptation. The infant's brain is perpetually striving for cognitive equilibrium.
Which is what the exact...
It's a comfortable, steady state where the world makes logical sense to them. But when new information disrupts that balance, the baby uses two distinct strategies: assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is taking a brand new experience and interpreting it through a scheme that already exists.
So using the old file folder.
Exactly. Say a baby knows what a dog is: 4 legs, fur, tail. They see a horse for the first time, point at it, and categorize it as a big dog. They assimilated the new animal into the existing file folder.
Which makes sense. That is a highly efficient way to process the world. But what happens when the new experience completely shatters those existing rules and assimilation basically fails?
That requires accommodation. The old scheme simply doesn't work anymore, so the brain is forced to modify it or build an entirely new framework to get back to that comfortable state of equilibrium.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Imagine you were at work, and management suddenly forces you to abandon the software you've used seamlessly for a decade.
Oh, I'd hate that.
We all would. You have to learn a completely new, incredibly complex system with a totally alien interface. That feeling of mental friction, the sheer cognitive effort and frustration it takes to rewire your daily workflow, that is the adult equivalent of a baby being forced to accommodate. It demands massive cognitive energy.
So when an infant goes through enough of that structural accommodation, their entire cognitive framework basically shifts. And that brings us to the sensoromotor stage, which spans from birth to roughly 2 years old. This period is defined by babies essentially thinking through their physical equipment.
Right, they don't have words yet.
Exactly. So how do they progress from just having involuntary reflexes to actually experimenting on their environment?
Well, in the very first month, behavior is almost entirely reflexive. They suck on anything placed near their mouth, exploring the world through that basic survival instinct. Soon, they transition into what Piaget termed circular reactions.
Meaning they loop the behavior.
Right. They accidentally do something with their body, find it interesting, and purposefully try to recreate it. By 4 to 8 months, they reach the secondary circular reaction phase. Now their focus shifts outward. They discover they have actual agency over their environment. They accidentally hit a hanging mobile, it spins, so they reach out and hit it again and again.
That inevitably leads to the tertiary circular reactions around 12 to 18 months, which honestly feels like the true mad scientist phase.
It really does.
A toddler will take a specific shaking motion they learned and apply it to every single object in the room just to test the variables. They shake a rattle, it makes noise. They shake a stuffed bear, nothing happens. They shake an open cup of milk, it goes everywhere. It is pure trial and error.
And through all of this physical, messy experimentation, they are working toward a massive cognitive milestone, object permanence.
The idea that things exist even when you can't see them.
Exactly. It's the fundamental understanding that an object continues to exist even when it is completely hidden from view. Early in the sensoromotor stage, if you throw a blanket over an infant's favorite toy, their brain processes the event as if the toy has literally ceased to exist in the universe.
They won't even try to look for it.
They just move on. But eventually, their working memory develops enough that they learn to pull the blanket away.
They still make some highly specific logical errors during this transition, though. The A not B search error stands out as a really bizarre glitch in their reasoning.
It's fascinating. The A not B error is a perfect window into how their memory and their motor skills overlap. You hide a toy under blanket A several times. The baby reaches under blanket A and finds it. Then, while the baby is watching you the entire time, you physically move the toy and hide it under blanket B.
And you'd think they would just reach for B.
Right, but an infant in this specific developmental window will reach straight back to blanket A. Their visual logic is being completely overridden by their motor memory.
So their brain essentially believes that their own physical action of reaching to spot A is the mechanism that makes the toy materialize.
Yes, they think their action creates the object.
Overcoming that motor bias seems like it would require a massive leap in brain power.
It does. Moving past the A not B error bridges the gap to the major milestone of mental representation. By 18 to 24 months, infants can finally hold internal depictions of the world in their mind without needing the physical object directly in front of them. This unlocks make-believe play. They can use a wooden block as a pretend phone because they are finally capable of symbolic thought.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Modern developmental scientists started looking at Piaget's timeline and realized there might be a flaw in the methodology. Piaget relied entirely on the baby's ability to physically reach for things or pull off blankets.
Which requires a lot of motor control.
Exactly. So what if infants understand physics and object permanence much earlier, but simply lack the physical motor coordination to prove it to us? I mean, how do researchers actually test the intelligence of a 3-month-old who can barely hold their own head up?
They developed an incredibly elegant methodology called the violation of expectation paradigm. If you want to test the cognitive boundaries of a pre-verbal, uncoordinated subject, you measure their surprise.
You look at how long they stare.
Right. You sit the infant down and habituate them to a normal expected event, something that obeys the standard laws of physics. You show it over and over until they get bored and look away. Then you show them a magic trick, an impossible event that breaks the rules of reality. If the infant stares significantly longer at the impossible event, it demonstrates that they had a pre-existing expectation of reality, and they recognize that the expectation was just violated.
Let's look at the specific experiment that proved this, which is the magic carrots. Picture a miniature puppet stage. The infant watches a short toy carrot slide behind a solid screen and emerge on the other side. Completely normal. Then they watch a tall carrot do the exact same thing. Still normal.
Establishing the baseline.
Exactly. Next, the researchers swap the screen for one that has a large window cut out at the top half. The short carrot passes behind it. It's too short to be seen in the window, and it comes out the other side. Makes logical sense. Finally, the test event. The tall carrot slides behind the screen with the window. It miraculously does not appear in the window, yet it still emerges out the other side intact.
What's fascinating here is the visual tracking data from that experiment completely upended Piaget's timeline. Infants as young as 3.5 months old stared significantly longer at the impossible tall carrot event.
Meaning they knew it was wrong.
Yes. They intuitively understood object solidity. They knew that a tall, solid object passing behind a window must be visible. They possessed object permanence months before they had the physical ability to search for a hidden toy.
And it extends way beyond basic physics into something called core knowledge systems. This is the theory that humans are born with rudimentary, innate knowledge regarding spatial navigation, physical properties, and even numbers. We mentioned earlier that babies are capable of arithmetic. How is that tested?
The infant arithmetic studies utilize that same violation of expectation method. Researchers place a 5-month-old in front of a small stage with one toy mouse on it. A screen comes up, hiding the mouse. A hand clearly reaches out from the side of the stage, holding a second identical toy mouse, goes behind the screen, and leaves empty-handed.
So the infant has just watched 1 + 1.
Exactly. If the screen drops to reveal 2 mice, the baby looks at it briefly and loses interest. The math checks out.
But the researchers run a second trial where they secretly remove one of the mice through a trap door before dropping the screen.
When the screen drops to reveal only 1 mouse, the 5-month-old stares significantly longer. They recognize the impossible math. Their core knowledge system tells them that 1 + 1 cannot equal 1.
That is just incredible.
It goes further. By 6 months old, infants can even estimate ratios. They can distinguish between large sets of items, say 8 dots versus 16 dots on a screen, as long as the difference is at least a 1-to-2 ratio. They have a built-in numerical estimation system running in the background.
To process physics and complex arithmetic like that, the infant brain must be incredibly sophisticated. This brings us to the information processing perspective. Instead of looking at the infant as a philosopher building schemes, this approach views their brain like a computer that is continuously upgrading its processor speed and expanding its RAM.
Cognitive gains aren't just about learning new concepts, they are about physical hardware maturation. The brain is getting functionally better at encoding data, storing it, and retrieving it. A prime example of this newfound efficiency is how infants allocate their attention.
They use something called the Goldilocks principle. By 7 months old, infants actively seek out stimuli that have a medium level of complexity.
Not too simple, not too complex.
Right. They ignore things that are too simple because there's nothing new to learn. They turn away from things that are too chaotic because it overloads their processing power. They prefer the medium complexity because it provides the maximum amount of new data for the exact amount of cognitive effort they are capable of outputting.
And as that processing speed increases, their memory capacity undergoes a massive upgrade. Researchers actually tested infant memory using a really clever operant conditioning setup with a crib mobile.
Oh, the ribbon experiment.
Yes. They placed infants in a crib and tied a soft ribbon from the baby's ankle to a mobile hanging above them. Within minutes, the infant learns the contingency. Kicking their leg makes the mobile spin and play music.
But the actual test of their hardware is what happens when you bring them back to the lab days or even weeks later.
They bring the babies back, place them in the exact same crib, but this time the ribbon is not connected to the mobile. Do they remember to kick? The data reveals a really steep developmental curve. A 2-month-old will remember the kicking trick for about 2 days.
Which is pretty good for 2 months.
It is, but a 6-month-old will retain that exact same memory for up to 2 winks. Their hard drive is expanding exponentially.
And that upgraded memory is what allows them to start organizing their environment through categorization. Because if you can't remember the properties of objects, you obviously can't group them together. By 6 months, infants can categorize items based on two distinct properties at once, like grouping all the red squares over here and the blue circles over
It
there.
gets even more complex.
Yeah, by 9 to 11 months, their categorization becomes incredibly nuanced. They can look at perceptually similar pictures of birds and airplanes and successfully distinguish between them. They are building separate internal folders for flying animals and flying machines.
The ultimate tool for that categorization is language. Words act as the ultimate sorting mechanism. When an infant learns a word, it helps them group physical objects, and having those grouped categories helps them acquire more words. It's a compounding loop of cognitive growth.
So let's trace that verbal progression from babbling to actual banter. To start, young infants are often described as citizens of the world. This refers to their ability to process phonemes, which are the fundamental distinct sounds that make up words.
This is truly one of the most remarkable features of the human infant. At birth, a baby can distinguish among nearly all the phonemes found in every single language spoken on Earth.
Every language.
Every single one. They are universally primed to learn Arabic, Mandarin, English, Tagalog, anything. They can hear subtle auditory distinctions that human adults are completely deaf to.
Yet they lose this universal ear remarkably fast. By 9 to 12 months, their brain begins to specialize exclusively in the sounds of their native environment. They stop discriminating foreign phonemes because the brain basically deems it no longer relevant to their immediate survival.
Once the brain commits to those native sounds, the vocalization progresses rapidly. The first 3 months feature mostly cooing long, drawn-out vowel sounds. Around 6 months, they begin babbling, which is the repetition of consonant-vowel combinations. Initially, babbling sounds identical regardless of where the baby is born.
But then it shifts.
Right. Between 8 and 11 months, a shift occurs. They begin to incorporate the specific intonation, rhythm, and pitch changes of their native language into their babbles.
Deaf infants actually go through a similar, fascinating process with sign language. If they are exposed to sign, they will babble with their hands. They imitate hand shapes and combine them in repetitive ways that don't hold actual meaning yet. They are practicing the physical mechanics of communication.
The transition to meaningful communication usually hits around 12 months with their first actual words, typically people or salient objects. As their vocabulary expands to around 150 to 200 words, they start deploying telegraphic speech.
Where they drop the grammar.
Yes, they string 2 or 3 words together, stripping away all the grammar, plurals, and past tense, leaving only the highest impact words.
Baby hungry, go store. It gets the job done. But as they experiment with vocabulary, toddlers run into categorization issues. They make highly logical errors, like overextension. They learn the word dog, understand it applies to a 4-legged animal with fur, and then proudly point at a cow in a field and yell, dog.
It highlights that they aren't just parroting sounds. They are actively testing the boundaries of the rules they've deduced. The inverse of that is underextension, where they apply a word too narrowly. They learn the word cat, but they believe it is a proper noun that only applies to the specific cat living in their house. A stray feline on the sidewalk is not a cat to them.
Adults really act as the primary guides to help them sort out these linguistic rules. One of the major environmental influences is joint attention, which kicks in around 9 months. It's simply when a caregiver and an infant focus on the exact same object or event.
The mechanics of joint attention represent a massive cognitive leap. It requires the infant to understand that the caregiver has their own independent gaze, goals, and focus. When a parent points at a toy, makes eye contact with the baby, and names the toy, they are establishing a shared reality. Infants who experience frequent joint attention acquire language significantly faster.
Caregivers also instinctively alter their voices, using infant-directed speech, or IDS. We all know the cadence, the high pitch, the exaggerated vowel sounds, the short sentences. It turns out this isn't just a cultural habit, it's an educational tool. Researchers track this and find that IDS directly correlates with better learning of phone categories and larger vocabularies by the end of the first year. The high contrast sounds grab the baby's attention and make the linguistic boundaries easier to process.
Caregivers also provide real-time grammatical feedback through recasting. When a toddler says something grammatically incorrect, like, "Mom, I get juice," the parent usually doesn't correct them directly. They validate the communication but restructure it into a proper sentence. "Yes, Mama will get you some juice." This subtle recasting provides the child with the correct syntactical structure without discouraging their attempt to speak.
All of this environmental input brings up the classic developmental debate of nature versus nurture. Is language an innate biological program, or is it entirely learned from the environment? The interactionist perspective blends the two, but the nativist perspective, championed by Noam Chomsky, argues heavily for biology. He proposed that humans possess a biologically hardwired language acquisition device.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the biological drive for language becomes undeniable when we examine the sensitive period. This is a distinct temporary window during early development when the brain's neurological architecture is uniquely primed to acquire language. If the brain does not receive linguistic input during this window, the consequences are severe and permanent.
We see this clearly in the devastating deprivation case of a girl known as Jeannie. She was subjected to horrific abuse, isolated in a room, and deprived of all human interaction and language until she was discovered at age 13.
Jeannie's case provided tragic but vital insights into the sensitive period. After her rescue, she underwent years of intensive linguistic therapy. She successfully acquired a vast vocabulary, learning the names of objects and actions. However, she never developed syntax.
The grammatical rules.
Right. She could not string words together using complex grammatical rules, remaining at the syntactical level of a typical 2-year-old. Her case suggests that while the brain remains plastic enough to learn vocabulary throughout life, the deep neural pathways required for processing grammar permanently close if they aren't stimulated during that critical early window.
We see another angle of this biological drive in deaf children who are born to hearing parents and are not exposed to sign language. By 9 months, these infants begin pointing, just like hearing children. But instead of stopping there, they spontaneously invent their own structured gestural language, known as home sign.
By 24 months, these children are combining their invented signs into structured sequences that perfectly mirror the telegraphic speech of hearing toddlers. Their brains possess the internal software for language and are desperately trying to execute it, even in the complete absence of external linguistic input.
The ultimate metric for the sensitive period comes from data on cochlear implants. These devices can restore hearing, providing a clear timeline of how brain plasticity fades.
The timelines are striking. If a deaf child receives a cochlear implant before the age of 2, their auditory cortex is still highly plastic. They begin babbling, typically, and by age 3 or 4, their language development closely mirrors their hearing peers. However, if the implantation is delayed until after age 4, the language deficits are severe and often permanent.
The window just closes.
The brain simply couldn't wait any longer. It pruned the unused auditory pathways and consolidated its resources elsewhere. The window for effortless grammatical acquisition slammed shut.
So what does this all mean? When we step back and look at the full scope of this developmental research, from Paget's little experimenters testing the physics of their toys, to 5-month-olds calculating arithmetic with toy mice, to the aggressive biological clock governing our capacity for language, the overarching takeaway is clear. The infant mind is not a passive blank slate waiting to be written on. It is a highly active, incredibly sophisticated machine, relentlessly decoding the physical and social universe. And you, the listener, successfully executed this exact same, staggeringly complex software installation.
This raises an important question, something to mull over today. We discussed how infants begin as citizens of the world, capable of hearing every foam in every human language, but their brains aggressively prune that ability away before their first birthday to become highly specialized in their native environment. It makes you wonder if our brains ruthlessly trade away the capacity to hear the full spectrum of global human language just to optimize for our immediate surroundings. What other dormant universal human capabilities might we have traded away in the process of growing up?
Welcome, everyone, to this custom-tailored deep dive. We are absolutely thrilled to have you joining us today.
Yeah, really glad to be here for this one.
If you are a lifelong learner, someone who just loves figuring out why we are the way we are, there's really no better place to start than day one.
Absolutely. Day one is where it all begins.
Right. And today's mission is to unpack this dense but frankly incredibly fascinating set of notes on emotional and social development, specifically in infancy and toddlerhood.
From the document Chapter 6, Emotional Infancy Study, PDF.
Exactly. And looking at this material, it is literally like looking at the blueprint of your own psychology.
It really is.
Think about it. How do we go from these tiny beings with just 3 baseline emotional states to complex, walking, talking toddlers with distinct personalities and deep self-awareness?
It's a massive transformation in a very short amount of time.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. Where exactly does the human emotional journey begin?
Well, it begins with the most fundamental building block of all human relationships: trust. Yeah. If we look at Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory, the very first stage of our personality development, and this is happening right from birth to about 1 year of age, is the conflict of basic trust versus mistrust.
So they are basically deciding right away if the world is good or bad.
Essentially, yes. During this stage, an infant relies entirely on responsive caregiving. When a caregiver provides consistent, loving care, the baby learns that the world is a safe, predictable place.
Right.
And that basic trust leads to a really powerful psychosocial strength, which Erickson defined as hope.
Hope. I love that.
Yeah, it's an openness to new experiences, but it's tempered by a healthy, realistic wariness that danger does exist in the world.
I always like to think of this early development as building a house. You need an incredibly solid foundation before you can even think about putting up the walls.
That's a great way to put it.
That foundation of trust has to be poured first, and it has to cure. Then once you have that, you move into the next phase, which is building the walls.
Which would be autonomy versus shame and doubt.
Exactly. That happens between 1 and 3 years old. Toddlers suddenly desire independence. They want to do things themselves.
The classic I can do it phase.
Yes. And if they are encouraged to do age-appropriate things, they succeed and become confident. But if they face harsh criticism or if expectations are way too high, they start to doubt their own abilities.
They fear failure.
Right. A successful balance there leads to what Erickson calls will, just the internal knowledge that you can intentionally act upon the world within certain limits.
But building those walls of autonomy requires an intense amount of preliminary emotional growth. The sheer speed of emotional evolution in just the first 6 months is staggering.
It really is fast.
Newborns actually come into the world with basic imitation skills. It acts as their first form of social coordination.
Though that specific reflex disappears around 3 to 4 months, right?
Correct. Now, initially, infants only show 3 baseline emotional states: contentment, interest, and distress.
Just 3.
Just those 3. And they signal them through facial expressions, body posture, and vocalizations.
It's easy to take for granted, but distilling human emotion down to just those 3 baseline states really highlights how fast the cognitive engine has to rev up.
Oh, absolutely.
Because by 6 to 8 weeks, that famous social smile emerges.
The one parents wait for eagerly.
Right. And then by 2 to 3 months, they can identify changes in the emotions of others, especially when they get matching information from a face and a voice.
Yeah.
And then by 5 to 7 months, they're reading emotions from just one channel, recognizing emotions on strangers' faces, displaying distinct, complex patterns like social engagement or passive withdrawal, even active protest.
It's a massive amount of growth in half a year. And what's fascinating here is how active this process is.
Active meaning they aren't just sitting there absorbing it.
Exactly. To truly understand the mechanics of early emotional connection, we have to look at something called the still face procedure.
Oh, this one is wild.
It brilliantly demonstrates the reciprocal nature of human interaction. So the procedure goes like this. A caregiver interacts with the infant in a completely normal, playful, engaging manner.
Right. Smiling, cooing.
Exactly. There is a natural rhythm of eye contact in play. Then suddenly, the caregiver stops responding entirely. They just present a blank, unmoving, still face.
And the baby's reaction is heartbreaking to watch. But it is so incredibly revealing about human nature.
And this response is common across all cultures, by the way.
Right. The infant immediately attempts to re-engage the caregiver. They smile bigger, they vocalize louder, they wave their arms, trying to restart that rhythmic dance.
And when that effort fails?
They usually break down and cry. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that babies aren't just passive little sponges soaking up the world. They fundamentally expect reciprocal social interaction.
They expect you to respond to their emotions, and when you don't, their sense of safety shatters.
Now, as they grow past that 6-month mark, their understanding of the world deepens, which ironically brings about entirely new emotional challenges.
Yes. Between 6 and 9 months, infants across all cultures develop 2 distinct types of anxiety.
The first being stranger anxiety.
Right, which can actually begin as early as 4 to 6 months. They show wariness or outright distress in response to unfamiliar people.
And the second is separation anxiety.
Distress when the primary caregiver leaves? That usually peaks around 12 to 15 months.
Now, while the word anxiety sounds negative to us as adults, in this context, it's actually a sign of a massive cognitive leap. It means the infant's brain is working correctly.
Exactly. Stranger anxiety is heavily linked to improved memory. The infant has learned the typical form of social interaction with familiar people.
Right. They know the routine.
So when a stranger comes along and doesn't follow that exact expected pattern, it leads to fear. They are also now highly capable of recognizing fear and anxiety in others' faces.
So these anxieties mean their brains are successfully predicting patterns and recognizing when those patterns are broken.
They know what normal looks like, and they know when someone doesn't fit it.
By the time they hit 9 to 12 months, they effectively turned into tiny social scientists.
They really do. Before 9 months, they generally only understand their own goals.
But suddenly, they start coordinating their goals with others. They use pointing and gesturing. They engage in joint attention,
Where the infant and the caregiver turn their attention toward an object at the exact same time.
which is incredibly helpful for learning language. It syncs up the word with the object in real time.
They also start utilizing something called social referencing.
Let's explain that because it's super important.
Sure. This is when infants actively use the vocal, facial, and gestural displays of their caregivers to regulate their own emotions and behavior in uncertain situations.
So think about when you're in a confusing meeting at work and someone proposes a completely wild idea. You probably immediately glance across the table at a trusted colleague to see how they are reacting.
We all do it.
If they look panicked, you start to panic. If they nod and look intrigued, you relax. Babies do the exact same thing to figure out the world.
It's spot on. They look at their caregiver to see if a new toy, a loud noise, or a new person is safe or scary.
They're outsourcing their emotional regulation to someone with more experience.
It's a perfect survival mechanism, and it paves the way for the next major milestone between 12 and 24 months, the development of the self.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Around 18 months, we see the emergence of self-conscious emotions.
We're talking about empathy, shame, embarrassment, pride, and guilt.
But to feel these things, you have to actually have a sense of self to begin with. Think about how strange it is that we all pass through a phase in our lives where we don't even know who is looking back at us in the mirror.
Right, self-awareness has to emerge before you can feel embarrassed about yourself.
And you see this emerging when toddlers start using personal pronouns.
Like me or I, or referring to themselves by their own name. There is also an increasing desire for autonomy, like we mentioned earlier with Erikson's theory.
But the classic proof of self-awareness is the rouge test.
The self-recognition mirror test.
Right. If you put a dab of rouge or makeup on a toddler's nose and put them in front of a mirror, a self-aware toddler will reach for their own nose to wipe it off.
They recognize the reflection as them, not another child.
But feeling these complex self-conscious emotions doesn't just happen automatically. It requires adult instruction. Parents and caregivers have to actually teach children when it is culturally appropriate to feel proud or guilty.
We aren't born knowing that we should feel ashamed for snatching a toy or proud for sharing one.
Exactly. The broader environment plays a huge role in emotional regulation.
During their second year, toddlers develop strategies to manage their feelings, like communicating emotions to an adult, seeking comfort from a favorite blanket, or using language when they are scared.
And caregivers actively shape this. Parents encourage infants to suppress negative emotions by imitating expressions of interest or happiness much more often than anger or sadness.
Interestingly, there is a clear gender difference in the data here. Boys actually receive more of this suppress the negative training than girls do. Yeah, which is an early environmentally driven contributor to gender differences in emotional expression later in life.
Wow. And culture plays a massive role in this emotional shaping too. Cultures that value social harmony strongly emphasize socially appropriate emotional behavior and often discourage expressing individual feelings.
We see this clearly when looking at Chinese and Japanese infants. They tend to smile, laugh, and cry less than their Western age mates.
Which naturally brings up a fascinating question. How much of our emotional baseline is learned from our culture or parents, and how much are we just born with? Let's talk about temperament.
Temperament refers to early appearing, stable individual differences in two main areas, reactivity and self-regulation.
Okay, break those down for us.
Reactivity is the quickness and intensity of emotional arousal, attention, and motor activity. Self-regulation is a set of strategies a person uses to modify that reactivity.
And developmentalists generally believe that these early psychological traits form the very basis of our adult personalities.
They do. The researchers Thomas and Chess famously identified 3 distinct temperamental types.
Right, so first you have easy children.
That's about 40% of the sample.
These are the babies who are cheerful, adaptable, and quickly establish regular routines for sleeping and eating.
Then you have difficult children, about 10%.
And these infants have intense, often negative reactions to new stimuli. They are slow to accept new experiences, and their daily routines are irregular.
Finally, there are the slow to warm up children, about 15%.
They are less active, have mild or low-key responses to stimuli, can be somewhat negative in mood, but if you give them time, they eventually adapt slowly to new experiences.
This classification isn't just a behavioral observation, it's deeply rooted in our biology. Jerome Kagan's research on the neurobiological basis of shyness is incredibly revealing here.
What did he find?
He found that a significant portion of infants show a behavioral inhibition or fearful response to novelty, and this stems from different arousal thresholds in the amygdala.
The brain's emotional processing center.
Exactly. Inhibited shy children actually experience much higher physiological arousal than uninhibited children when faced with the exact same new situation.
So shyness isn't just a personality quirk or a choice. It's a measurable physiological response to novelty.
Very measurable. These shy infants have higher heart rates,
Higher cortisol stress hormone levels.
greater pupil dilation, even blood pressure increases when faced with something new.
And they show greater EEG activity in the right frontal lobe of the brain, which is associated with negative emotions. Whereas highly sociable children show the opposite pattern in their brainwaves.
Twin studies further demonstrate the influence of heredity on these traits. Identical twins are much more similar in their activity levels, social fearfulness, and proneness to anger than fraternal twins.
There are even indications of hormonal influences, too.
Right. Experiments administering testosterone in animals lead to higher activity levels. That might partly explain why, on average, human males are slightly more active than females. Though environmental treatment by parents surely compounds that biological baseline. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that biology is not destiny. Environment heavily modifies these temperamental traits.
For example, nutrition matters immensely. Iron deficiencies in a young infant's diet are associated with lower activity levels, greater negative emotionality, and lower effortful control.
And parenting practices literally alter the biological expression of a child's temperament.
Infants become demonstrably more fearful when their mothers are depressed.
And if an infant is naturally shy, warm and supportive parenting can reduce their intense reactivity over time.
But cold, intrusive parenting heightens their anxiety. Which brings us to the crucial concept of goodness of fit. I like to compare it to a tailored suit. You aren't trying to change the underlying shape of the person. You are creating an environment, a suit that perfectly accommodates the child's unique temperamental shape, helping them respond adaptively to the world.
That's a highly accurate way to look at it. If there's a poor fit, say, putting an intensely difficult or shy child in a chaotic, rigid, or highly demanding environment without support, the outcomes can be tough.
Right.
An infant with an insecure attachment combined with behavioral inhibition is strongly associated with social anxiety later in adolescence.
Which naturally brings us to the most vital relationship dynamic of all, attachment.
Attachment is the strong, affectionate tie we feel towards special people in our lives that gives us joy and comforts us during stress.
When we talk about the psychological roots of attachment, we have to mention Harry Harlow's famous experiments with rhesus monkeys.
Classic study.
He offered baby monkeys a choice: a harsh wire surrogate mother that provided food from a bottle, and a soft terry cloth surrogate mother that provided no food at all.
And the results were striking.
The monkeys overwhelmingly preferred to cling to the cloth mother, only reaching over to the wire mother when they were practically starving.
It proved that attachment isn't just a transactional relationship about who feeds you. It's fundamentally about contact, comfort, and feeling physically safe.
John Bowlby expanded on this concept with his ethological theory of attachment.
He argued that infants have an innate, evolutionarily designed attachment behavioral system.
So built-in signals like crying, gazing, and smiling, they ensure that parents stay close to meet the infant's needs for survival.
And caregivers, in turn, have biologically based responses to those specific signals. Over time, through warm and sensitive care, a true affectional bond develops between them.
This affectional bond is tested and categorized using Mary Ainsworth's famous strained situation assessment.
It's essentially a tiny dramatic play designed to trigger an infant's separation anxiety and test their use of the parent as a secure base.
Right. It involves a series of 8 short episodes. First, the parent and infant are in a room with toys. Then a stranger enters.
Then the parent leaves, which is the first separation.
Then the parent returns and the stranger leaves. The first reunion.
Then the infant is left totally alone in the room.
Then the stranger returns, and finally the second reunion with the parent.
Based on how the infant reacts to those separations and reunions, Ainsworth identified distinct attachment patterns. The most common is secure attachment.
About 62% of infants.
These infants use the parent as a secure base to explore the toys. They may or may not cry when the parent leaves, but upon reunion, they express positive emotions. They are easily comforted if they were upset and quickly go back to exploring.
Then you have insecure avoiding detachment, roughly 15%.
Right. These babies don't seem to use the parent as a secure base. They generally aren't upset when the parent leaves, and they actively avoid or ignore the caregiver upon return. They treat the parent and the stranger pretty much the same way.
Next is insecure ambivalent or resistant attachment, about 8%.
These infants cling tightly to the mother and fail to explore the toys. They are highly distressed by the separation, but upon reunion, they display anger. They might resist being held, hit the parent, and are very difficult to comfort.
Finally, there is a fourth category identified by later researchers, insecure disorganized attachment, another 15%.
This reflects the greatest insecurity. These infants show contradictory, confused behaviors, like approaching the parent but suddenly freezing, or appearing dazed, depressed, and fearful upon reunion.
You might assume that disorganized attachment is solely the result of severe neglect or abuse, and it is heavily associated with those tragic circumstances, but there is also a mind-blowing genetic component at play here.
It is a true gene-environment interaction. Think of certain genes like a volume dial for environmental sensitivity,
For instance, infants with a short 5-HTT-LPR gene,
which is associated with emotional reactivity.
they have a much greater risk of developing disorganized attachment, but only if their caregiving is insensitive.
Similarly, maternal trauma is associated with disorganized attachment only for infants carrying a specific DRD4-7 repeat gene.
It perfectly illustrates how our DNA and our environment are in a constant, intricate dance.
And the environment can actually be shifted to change the dance steps.
Mm.
Interventions that teach sensitive caregiving to the parents of difficult babies have been shown to directly enhance attachment security.
There is a massive silver lining in the long-term data from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, or NICHD.
They tracked these kids and looked at cognitive, social, and emotional outcomes at 3 years old.
Obviously, the best outcomes were for children who had secure attachment at 15 months and experienced sensitive parenting at 24 months.
And the worst outcomes were for those with insecure attachment early on, followed by insensitive parenting later.
But here is the kicker. Children with insecure attachment in early infancy, but who received sensitive mothering at 24 months, had better overall outcomes than children who started with secure attachment but experienced insensitive mothering at 24 months.
It's incredible data.
So what does this all mean? It means the story isn't written in stone in year one.
The human brain is remarkably plastic. Later sensitive care can literally overwrite early insecurity.
That is perhaps the ultimate takeaway here. Understanding these early developmental milestones, from the still-face procedure and the biology of a shy temperament,
Yes.
right through to the complex genetic and environmental dance of attachment styles. It isn't just a clinical exercise for pediatricians or new parents.
For you, the listener, it provides profound insight into the mechanics of human connection. It explains how your specific emotional regulation strategies were formed and how your earliest environments literally shaped the wiring of your brain.
We've covered a massive journey today, looking at how trust is built block by block, how anxiety is actually a sign of cognitive growth, and how something as fundamental as whether we approach a new situation with fear or excitement is a complex cocktail of our genetics and our caregivers' early responses.
This raises an important question. If our earliest emotional blueprints, our biological reactions to novelty, and our core attachment styles are laid down before we even have the capacity for language or explicit memory,
Yeah.
how many of our adult gut instincts or intuitions about whether a situation or a person is safe are actually just the ghosts of our pre-verbal toddlerhood trying to steer the ship? When you instantly distrust someone or feel inexplicably safe with another, is that your adult wisdom? Or is that your inner 15-month-old recognizing a familiar pattern?
That is an incredible thought to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring the fascinating blueprints of the human mind, and we will see you next time. Welcome back, learner. We are so thrilled to have you with us for another deep dive.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Today, we have a really fascinating mission. We are going to decode the explosive, sometimes chaotic, and completely magical growth of the preschool-aged mind and body.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. To do this, we've pulled together some incredible material from two highly comprehensive chapters on developmental psychology and early childhood.
Right.
The first half focuses heavily on physical and brain development, while the second takes us right into the cognitive and language leaps that happen during these crucial years.
And our goal today is to give you, the learner, a real shortcut to understanding the mechanics of early childhood. We want to connect the physical, literal wiring of the maturing brain to the behavioral changes you actually see in kids.
Because it can be wild.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
If you've ever spent time around a preschooler, you know it can feel like you're interacting with a tiny alien who is, rapidly trying to figure out how gravity, language, and human emotions work all at the exact same time.
Okay, let's unpack this because there's this wild paradox when it comes to preschoolers.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that a human being who physically cannot tie their own shoes can successfully learn 10,000 words and deliberately outsmart a fully grown adult with a carefully constructed lie? It sounds impossible when you put it like that.
It does, but when we look at the data, it all comes down to how their physical body and their brain are upgrading simultaneously. To understand the mind, we actually have to start with the body.
So if they are preparing to take these massive cognitive leaps, what is actually happening to their physical frame to support that?
Well, when kids transition out of infancy into the preschool years, their growth rate actually slows down quite a bit.
Really?
Yeah, during infancy, they are just ballooning in size. But from ages 2 to 6, on average, they are only gaining about 3 kilograms, roughly 5 pounds, and adding about 2 to 3 inches in height per year.
But they look so completely different. I mean, a 5-year-old doesn't look like a scaled-up baby.
Exactly. The shape of their body completely transforms. They lose that baby fat, their arms and legs lengthen, and most importantly, they stop being so top-heavy.
Oh, right, because babies have giant heads.
Right, a baby's head is massive compared to its body, which throws off their balance. When those proportions stretch out, their center of gravity shifts downward into their torso.
Which must completely unlock their gross motor skills, right?
Dig time.
Because when you watch a 2-year-old, they might hop a few times, but it's incredibly clumsy. They look like they're going to tip over at any second. But then you look at a 5-year-old, and they are hopping, skipping, throwing, catching, and just changing direction on a dime.
It's a total physical revolution. And this brings us to a really important concept in developmental research called the dynamic systems approach.
Dynamic systems.
Right. We often assume that a child learns to hop simply because their leg muscles finally got strong enough. But the dynamic systems approach explains that a new skill emerges gradually from the integration of many different separate components.
Wait, so it's not just about muscle strength. What else has to align for a kid to just hop on one foot?
It requires proprioception, which is your brain knowing exactly where your limbs are in space.
Okay.
It requires the physical maturation of the nervous system, the motivation to actually want to do the movement, and tons of practice. All those pieces develop at different rates, and they have to sync up.
It's like an orchestra finally learning to play in time together. One section is the muscles, one is the brain, one is balance.
Exactly.
And we see this same intricate coordination and fine motor milestones, too. Between ages 2 and 3, kids can manage simple clothing and pull a zipper up. By 3 or 4, they graduate to the dexterity needed for buttons.
Which is incredibly complex for tiny fingers.
Right, and by 5, they can fully dress and undress themselves. But the ultimate challenge, the final boss of preschool fine motor skills, is tying shoelaces. That usually doesn't happen until age 6.
And it's worth noting here that girls generally mature faster than boys in these fine motor areas, which is often reflected in how they draw. Drawing is actually an incredible window into multiple developmental domains at once.
The progression of drawing is amazing. At 18 months, a toddler holds a crayon in this rigid power grip and just mashes it into the paper to scribble.
Total chaos.
Yeah. But by age 4, many can legibly write their own names. And then there's that classic milestone around age 4 to 5, the tadpole person.
Yes. It's universally how kids from all over the world start drawing humans.
It's so funny and endearing. It's just a big circle for a head with 2 straight lines sticking out the bottom for legs and 2 lines sticking out the sides for arms. No torso whatsoever.
Just a head and limbs.
But it shows they're starting to spatially represent the world. But all of this external physical growth The hopping, the zipping, the drawing, that's just a reflection of what's happening inside the skull?
Oh, absolutely. The internal construction project is staggering. By age 2, the human brain has already reached 80% of its adult volume. Wow.
And between ages 2 and 6, it grows another 10%.
90% of a fully grown adult brain by age 6. That is wild.
It is. And during this time, the brain becomes highly specialized. For instance, the left hemisphere, which primarily handles language, is incredibly active between ages 3 and 6, and then its growth rate levels off.
Makes sense with the language explosion.
Right. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere, which is responsible for spatial skills like that tadpole drawing or eventually reading a map, increases steadily throughout early and middle childhood.
The material we're looking at also throws out a lot of heavy neuroanatomy terms here. It talks about the reticular formation, the cerebellum, the amygdala, the hippocampus.
A lot of jargon.
Yeah. For those of us who aren't neuroscientists, what is actually happening to these structures to cause such massive behavioral changes?
The key mechanism here is called myelination. Think of the neurons in a child's brain like bare copper wires. Myelination is the process of wrapping those wires in a fatty insulating layer.
Like rubber on a cable. Exactly. Just like rubber insulation on a wire, myelin stops the electrical signals from leaking out, which means brain signals can travel exponentially faster. It's like upgrading the brain from dial-up internet to high-speed fiber optics.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. So when the reticular formation gets myelinated, what does that upgrade do for the child?
The reticular formation controls alertness and consciousness, so when that gets its high-speed upgrade, the child's attention span noticeably boosts.
Okay, what about the cerebellum?
When the cerebellum gets upgraded, it forms faster connections to the cerebral cortex, which gives the child that smooth, coordinated motor control we talked about.
Yeah.
And then you have the amygdala, which processes emotions, and the hippocampus, which handles memory. Both of those are forming super fast pathways to the prefrontal cortex.
And the prefrontal cortex is basically the CEO of the brain, right?
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, all of this high-speed wiring to the prefrontal cortex is building what we call executive function.
Executive function.
Right. It's the brain's management system. It involves working memory, the ability to flexibly shift your attention, and inhibitory control, which is the ability to stop yourself from doing something impulsive, like hitting a sibling when you're mad.
Which is obviously a work in progress for a preschooler. But what I found fascinating is that while executive function is strongly predicted by a child's genetics, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. The environment plays a huge role in how well that CEO of the brain develops.
A massive role. The research shows that environmental factors like family income, chronic stress, maternal depression, and food insufficiency have a direct, measurable impact on the development of these executive function skills.
So stress literally changes the brain.
Yes. A brain that is constantly stressed has a much harder time building those high-speed neural pathways.
But if they're physically growing and their brain is getting this massive high-speed upgrade, how does that translate to how they actually think? Because preschoolers seem to live entirely in a world of make-believe.
This is where we see the shift from magic to logic. In developmental psychology, there are two major heavyweights who looked at this: Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky.
Right.
Piaget defined ages 2 to 6 as the preoperational stage. This stage is defined by an explosion of symbolic representation, which is why kids this age are so incredible at make-believe play. A cardboard box can genuinely become a spaceship, but they completely lack a logical mental operations.
I love the classic example of this from the source. If you take a clear glass of milk and pour it into a red plastic cup right in front of them, a pre-operational child doesn't just think the milk looks red.
No, they don't.
They truly believe the milk is now red. They are completely tricked by appearances.
And that focus on appearances explains so many daily preschooler meltdowns.
Like the Halloween mask phenomenon. You hear stories of parents putting on a scary monster mask thinking they're being playful, but the 3-year-old bursts into terrified tears.
Yes.
To the adult, it's just a piece of rubber. But to the kid, their parent is literally gone, replaced by a monster. Why can't they rationalize that it's just mom or dad under there?
Because of specific cognitive limitations that Piaget identified. One is irreversibility. Their brain cannot mentally reverse the action of taking the mask off.
Interesting.
Another is centration. They focus on only one highly noticeable aspect of a situation. So they center entirely on the scary rubber face and completely ignore the fact that the monster is wearing their dad's favorite sweater and has their dad's voice.
That explains so much. And we also have to talk about egocentrism. This is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but in this context, it doesn't mean the kid is selfish, right?
Not at all. Egocentrism in early childhood simply means an inability to see the world from anyone else's point of view.
Which is why a kid will be playing in their bedroom, find a random toy under the bed,
Yeah.
and yell out to you in the living room, "Hey, what's this?" They genuinely assume that because they can see the toy, you must be able to see it too, through 3 solid walls.
Exactly. They also exhibit animism, giving inanimate objects feelings and lifelike properties. You know, the cloud is crying because it's raining, or the stuffed bear is lonely. Now, it is important to note that modern research has updated Piaget's theories quite a bit.
He was a little too rigid with his stages, wasn't he?
He was. We now know that cognitive development isn't just a series of abrupt, rigid stages you suddenly graduate from. It's much more gradual. If you simplify the tasks, preschoolers make far fewer errors. And importantly, they can be taught logic. They don't just have to wait to age out of being illogical.
Which brings us to Vygotsky. Where Piaget focused on kids learning through independent, hands-on discovery, Vygotsky looked at the social side of learning. He believed children learn best through interactions with people who know more than they do.
Yes, Vygotsky gave us the concept of the zone of proximal development.
Right.
This is the learning sweet spot. It's the gap between what a child can do entirely on their own and what they can achieve if an adult or an older kid helps them. And the way adults navigate this zone is through a technique called scaffolding.
Just like scaffolding on a building. You provide temporary support so they can reach higher. You adjust the amount of help you give based on what the child needs in that exact moment.
Exactly.
If it's too easy, they get bored. If it's too hard, they throw the puzzle across the room. But Vygotsky also pointed out something really interesting about how kids talk. Why is it that 3-year-olds are constantly narrating their own lives out loud to an empty room?
He called this private speech, and it's a vital cognitive tool. They aren't just babbling for the sake of making noise. They are using their own speech to guide their attention, plan their actions, and calm themselves down.
So they are literally coaching themselves through life.
Yes. Research shows they do it a lot more when a task is suddenly challenging or after they've made a mistake and are trying to figure out the next step. What's amazing is that by the time they hit age 7, this private speech doesn't disappear, it mostly internalizes. It becomes what you and I experience right now as our inner thought monologue.
That is incredible. It's the literal birth of the voice in our heads. Now, since we are talking about them guiding their own attention, let's look at how their actual attention spans are developing. Because keeping a toddler focused feels like herding cats.
Cognitive neuroscientists actually break attention down into 3 distinct types during this age. You have sustained attention, which is focusing on one single task. You have selective attention, which is the ability to ignore distractions. And executive attention, which is shifting focus between different things seamlessly.
There's a brilliant video study mentioned in the research that illustrates this perfectly. They put kids in a room and had them watch a puppet show. A 4.5-year-old will sit there, stay focused, and stare at the puppet show for a significant chunk of time.
Right.
But a 2.5-year-old, they spend 25% of the time just looking away, completely distracted by a speck of dust or a chair in the room. Their sustained attention simply hasn't wired itself yet.
And that underdeveloped brain infrastructure also explains one of the most profound mysteries of human existence, our earliest memories.
I want you, the learner, to think about this for a second. What is your very first memory? How old were you? According to the data, the average adult's earliest memory dates back to about 3.5 years old. Everything before that is just a blank slate.
What's fascinating here is why we have such weak, early autobiographical memories. It's a combination of factors. First, the physical areas of the brain responsible for memory formation are still under construction.
Sure.
Second, infants and young toddlers lack a cohesive sense of self. If you don't know who I am yet, it's hard to store a memory about what happened to me.
And they don't have the vocabulary yet either.
Right. Because they can't encode information verbally, it makes it incredibly hard to store and retrieve later in life once they become verbal creatures. Instead, very young children rely on what researchers call scripts.
Scripts?
Yeah, they remember the general outline of a routine, like the sequence of eating dinner, taking a bath, and reading a book, rather than specific, isolated one-off events.
But there is a highly actionable takeaway here for anyone raising kids. Parents can actually shape how well their kids remember their own lives. It's called using an elaborative style.
This is so important.
Yeah, if you ask your child questions about their day, add emotional context, and ask for their opinions like, wasn't it scary when that dog barked at the park? What did you think about that? Those children actually grow up to have much more detailed and organized personal memories later in life.
That social back and forth interaction literally builds the framework for memory. And that same social interaction builds something equally critical called theory of mind.
Theory of mind.
Right. This is the understanding that other people have their own thoughts, wants, memories, and beliefs that are completely separate from your own.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the ultimate test for theory of mind is understanding false beliefs. At age 3, a child generally cannot comprehend that someone else can hold a belief in their head that is factually wrong.
Let's picture a scenario. If a 3-year-old watches you hide a toy in a drawer, they know the toy is in the drawer. But if mom walks into the room and you ask the 3-year-old, where does mom think the toy is? The 3-year-old will say, in the drawer.
Even though mom didn't see it.
Exactly. They assume that because they know the truth, everyone in the world must magically know the truth.
But between 4 and 5 years old, a switch flips in their brain.
Yeah.
They realize, wait, I know the toy is in the drawer, but mom wasn't in the room. Mom thinks it's still in the toy box.
And the consequence of this realization is one of the funniest milestones in childhood.
They start lying.
They really dare.
They start using deception and hide and seek and telling deliberate, bald-faced lies to get out of trouble. No, I didn't eat the cookie while entirely covered in chocolate. As frustrating as it is for a parent to be lied to, a 4-year-old telling a lie is actually a massive cause for celebration. It proves their theory of mind is fully functioning. Your kid just manipulated your mental state. That is a healthy, developing brain.
They've unlocked a whole new level of social manipulation, and they are doing all of this using an entirely new superpower, a massive, rapidly expanding vocabulary.
The language explosion in these years is just staggering. Listen to these numbers. At 16 months, a toddler understands about 169 words. By age 5 or 6, that same child comprehends the meanings of an estimated 10,000 words. How is that physically possible?
They achieve this through a process called fast mapping. Children can quickly acquire the approximate meaning of a completely new word after just 1 or 2 exposures. And they use incredibly logical rules to figure things out on the fly.
Like what?
Well, one of the main rules they use is the mutual exclusivity bias.
Let's walk through exactly how that works, because it's brilliant. Say you have a banana, which the child knows, and a kiwi, which they have never seen before in their life.
Right. If you set both fruits on the table and say, hand me the kiwi, the child's brain goes to work. They know the yellow thing is a banana. Therefore, by mutual exclusivity, the weird green fuzzy thing must be the kiwi. They mapped a new word to a new object instantly without you ever having to define it for them.
It's pure deduction. But because they are guessing and deducing so fast, they make some really common and very funny errors regarding the boundaries of words. They do underextension, where they use a word too narrowly. They might insist that the rose in their garden is a flower, but if you point to a daisy, they get mad and say, no, that's not a flower.
And they also do overextension, which is using a word way too broadly. If they learn the word dog, suddenly every single 4-legged animal they see in the park, whether it's a horse, a cow, or a squirrel, is a dog.
But it's not just vocabulary, it's grammar. At 18 months, they're using telegraphic speech, just the bare essential words like want juice. But suddenly they are speaking in complex sentences, and we know they aren't just a parrot mimicking their parents. They're actively decoding the underlying rules of the English language.
The famous Burko-Wug test is the best proof of this. Researchers showed young kids a picture of a little cartoon bird and said, this is a wug. Then they showed them a picture of 2 of these birds side by side and said, now there are 2, and paused. The children spontaneously filled in the blank with wugs.
They had never heard the word wug before in their lives, but they instantly knew the English rule for making something plural involves adding an "es" sound.
Exactly. And they apply these rules so logically that they demonstrate what linguists call over-regularization.
Yes. This is when your kids suddenly start saying things like, I run fast, or look at those 2 mouses. Parents often think their kid is regressing, but they aren't.
Not at all.
They didn't learn run from you. They smartly took the standard grammar rules for past tense and plurals and applied them to the irregular exceptions in English.
This raises an important question, though. With all this rapid language acquisition happening, how should we be talking to kids? We know exposing kids to a high quantity of words matters, but a landmark 2015 study by Hirsch Pasek and her colleagues found something much more nuanced.
Quality over quantity. The study showed that the quality of the communication is actually a much stronger predictor of vocabulary growth than just blasting a kid with a sheer volume of words.
The researchers looked at fluency and connectedness, which is the overall rhythm and flow of a conversation, and something called symbol-infused joint engagement.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it basically means how well the adult and child actively focus on the same object together, making eye contact, using words and gestures in a shared moment.
It turns out language isn't just audio playing in the background. It's about genuine connection. If you are sitting in the room with a child, but you are scrolling on your smartphone, it actively disrupts that shared engagement. Even if you are talking out loud to them while staring at your screen, that lack of face-to-face back-and-forth rhythm actually hinders their language development. They need you to be present.
The context of the communication is everything. And speaking of rich language contexts, we have to touch on bilingualism.
The bilingual mind. The research looks at whether a child learns two languages simultaneously from birth, or sequentially, mastering one before starting another. Are there any downsides to learning two languages at once?
There are some very minor costs early on. A bilingual preschooler might have a slightly smaller vocabulary per individual language compared to a peer who only speaks one language. They might also experience slight temporary delays in retrieving a specific word.
But the benefits massively outweigh those tiny costs. The data shows that bilingual kids actually develop denser gray matter in the areas of the cortex associated with verbal fluency. They perform significantly better on executive function tasks.
Oh, yeah?
And tying it all back, they show advantages in tests of theory of mind and distinguishing appearance from reality at much earlier ages than their monolingual peers.
The overarching consensus in the scientific community is incredibly clear. Learning two languages in infancy and early childhood is a massive cognitive advantage.
So what does this all mean? When we take a step back and look at all this incredible information, the chaotic energy of a preschooler, the clumsy running, the drawing of weird tadpole people, the talking to themselves in the corner, the sudden bold-faced lying, the grammatical mistakes like, I runned.
Yeah.
None of this is actually chaos. It is a series of beautiful, highly orchestrated, and totally logical steps in their physical and cognitive wiring.
That is the perfect takeaway. Understanding these underlying mechanics changes everything about how we interact with young kids. Whether you are a parent, an aunt, an uncle, an educator, or just a curious human being, knowing why a child behaves this way changes how you view them. It gives you an infinite well of patience because instead of seeing a tiny human being difficult, you suddenly have a clear roadmap to what is happening under the hood.
It really does. It reframes everyday frustration into pure fascination.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on what we've discussed today about memory. We learned that our earliest life experiences before age 3.5 are encoded as nonverbal scripts because our brains couldn't process language yet.
Right.
And those specific memories are largely lost to our conscious autobiographical brain. It makes you wonder, how many of our deeply held adult habits, our unexplained fears, or our sudden gut emotional reactions are simply ghost scripts. Scripts written by a toddler who couldn't yet speak, operating completely invisibly in the background of our adult lives.
Wow. Ghost scripts running the background of our minds. That is definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this Deep Dive Learner. We hope it gave you some incredible aha moments and a new appreciation for the human brain. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning. We'll catch you on the next one.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you're joining us today, you're probably someone who, loves understanding why people do the things they do. And today we have a pretty fascinating mission. We're looking at a stack of research, specifically this really dense, incredibly detailed academic document.
Yeah, it's titled K9 Emotional Socially Stew.pdf. Rolls right off the tongue.
Right, exactly. But it covers social and emotional development in early childhood. And our goal today is to kind of give you a shortcut, a way to bypass all that heavy academic jargon and jump straight to understanding the incredibly complex psychological calibration that happens in the first few years of life.
It's a critical window.
It really is. We're talking about how tiny humans develop their sense of self, how they navigate playground politics, and exactly how they build their moral compass completely from scratch.
Because early childhood isn't just about learning to walk and talk.
No, not at all. It is this intense, high-stakes period of development that explains a whole lot about the adults you interact with every single day. So, okay, let's unpack this.
It really is a high-stakes period, and I mean, it lays the foundation for literally everything that comes after.
Right.
A great place to ground this whole conversation is with Erickson's theory of development.
Right.
He has this specific stage for early childhood, and he calls it initiative versus guilt. This is the exact moment a child's concept of self really starts to form as something totally distinct from their parents.
They realize they're their own person.
Exactly. They are suddenly experiencing these massive leaps in physical and cognitive abilities, and they start engaging in what psychologists call goal-directed activity. Basically, play suddenly gets a very real purpose.
Right. So it's not just, killing time or randomly banging wooden blocks together anymore.
Yeah, it's much more intentional.
Like when a toddler is pushing a plastic toy vacuum around the living room, they aren't just playing. They are actively exploring adult roles. They're testing out the morals and the social expectations of their culture. But balancing that out it seems tricky.
Very tricky.
Because a kid wants total independence, but a parent obviously has to keep them from, accidentally vacuuming up the family hamster or something.
Yeah, exactly. And that tension, that's the core of Erickson's stage. The optimal outcome is striking a balance. The child learns to balance their individual initiative, which is that drive to do things themselves, with a willingness to actually cooperate and work with others.
But what fuels that initiative is, I think it's one of the most brilliant evolutionary tricks we have as humans.
Oh, the positivity bias.
Yes.
Yeah.
I absolutely love the positivity bias. Every parent, or honestly anyone who has ever spent 5 minutes with a toddler, has seen this in action.
Oh, for sure.
A 4-year-old will confidently tell you they are the fastest runner on planet Earth immediately after you just watch them trip over their own feet on a totally flat surface.
They really will. Children in early childhood describe themselves with supreme, almost comical overconfidence. They define themselves by their physical attributes, their toys, their skills.
Just listing things they own.
Right. And they do it with this absolute certainty that they are amazing at literally everything.
But it's not just kids being arrogant, right? There's a biological superpower hidden in that delusion.
How so?
Well, if a child were completely realistic about their abilities at age 3, they would probably give up on walking or talking or building blocks after the first 5 failures.
That's a great point.
That supreme overconfidence keeps them trying new things and maintains their motivation. They have to believe they're a master chef while making you a soup out of mud and an old shoe. Otherwise, they'd never learn to actually cook later in life.
That is precisely it. The positivity bias protects their ego while they fail repeatedly. But of course, as they push those boundaries and inevitably face actual obstacles, they experience a massive range of new, very intense emotions.
And they do not have the vocabulary to handle it.
Not at all.
Which begs the question, how do they even begin to manage that? If a child is feeling completely overwhelmed because their cracker broke in half, how do we help them understand that feeling when they can barely string a sentence together?
That is where visual frameworks come in, and the research highlights how critical these are between the ages of 2 and 5. Children learn strategies for checking their emotions, sometimes by just covering their eyes or ears to restrict sensory input.
Like physically blocking out the world.
Right. But to really build emotional competence, educators and parents use visual categorizations. A very popular one is sorting feelings into color-coded zones.
Visuals make so much sense for that age. You have the blue zone, which is for when a kid is feeling sad or tired, sick, or maybe just bored. Then there's the green zone, which is the ultimate goal. That's when they're happy, calm, focused, ready to learn. Then you move up to the yellow zone, the warning area.
The danger zone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's frustration, anxiety, or even just feeling overly silly and losing control. And finally, the red zone.
The red zone is the full meltdown. Angry, overwhelmed, devastated. Giving kids these simple colors to categorize their feelings helps build emotional competence, which the data directly links to social competence later on. If you can name it, you can tame it.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is the biology behind these self-conscious emotions, especially when we look at the neurological difference between guilt and shame.
Okay.
Because by age 3, self-conscious emotions are deeply linked to self-evaluation. Children become incredibly sensitive to disappointing an adult. And researchers actually looked at the brain chemistry here. They found that intense shame causes a literal spike in cortisol.
The primary stress hormone.
Exactly.
Hey, a spike in cortisol just from feeling ashamed? How does that work in practice? What is the distinction between a kid just being a little embarrassed versus experiencing a cortisol spiking level of shame?
It comes down to how the feedback is delivered. Simple embarrassment, like if you just compliment a child and draw a lot of attention to them, That doesn't lead to a rise in cortisol.
Yeah.
But when a caregiver's feedback links a child's performance to their overall worth or character, rather than just focusing on their behavior, it evokes intense shame.
Ah, so it's the difference between saying you did a bad thing versus you are a bad kid.
Yes, and that distinction is crucial. When we look at the data on Western children, intense shame is highly associated with a sense of personal inadequacy. It leads to withdrawal, depression, and often anger or aggression.
Because the child internalizes that they're fundamentally broken.
Exactly. Guilt, on the other hand, when it happens in appropriate circumstances and isn't weighed down by shame, is actually related to good adjustment. Healthy guilt leads to making reparations. It makes the child think, I did something wrong, how can I fix it?
It's a subtle shift in language, but it has a massive biological and psychological impact.
Huge impact.
Really makes you think about how many adults are walking around today with imposter syndrome or deep anxiety just because they were disciplined with shame instead of healthy guilt.
It really does.
Now, as these children are figuring out who they are, managing these cortisol spikes and navigating their feelings, they're also figuring out gender. And the timeline the data provides for this is remarkably fast.
It is incredibly fast.
Yeah.
By 2.5 years old, children confidently describe themselves as male or female.
Wow.
Yeah. Between 3 and 5 years, they begin showing a clear preference for gender-typed toys, activities, and clothing. And then by ages 6 to 7, they achieve what developmental psychologists call gender constancy.
Okay, for those of us who aren't developmental psychologists, what exactly does gender constancy mean in practice?
It's the cognitive understanding that their gender is a permanent, biologically based characteristic. They realize it remains unchanged regardless of outward appearances.
As opposed to earlier on.
Right before this age, a toddler's grasp of reality is very fluid. A 4-year-old might honestly believe that if a boy puts on a dress and grows his hair out, he literally transforms into a girl. Gender constancy is the realization that the underlying biology doesn't change just because the clothing does.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material dives deep into a developmental systems framework to understand how these gender concepts and behaviors actually form. And it looks at this through a very complex web of both biology and the environment.
It does.
And just to be clear, we're going to look strictly at what the data presents on both sides of this equation, acting purely as impartial observers of the research.
Exactly. Looking first at the strictly biological perspective, the research points to widespread sex differences across various mammalian species regarding activity levels, physical aggression, and even preference for same-sex playmates.
Right.
Experiments with non-human mammals consistently show increased active play and aggression in males. But the research also heavily highlights data on human girls born with a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH.
Can you break down what CAH is in layman's terms?
Certainly. CAH involves higher prenatal exposure to androgens, which are male sex hormones. The data shows that girls with CAH have a strong tendency to prefer toys and activities that are traditionally considered male preferences.
Okay.
They also frequently prefer social interaction and active play with males over females.
And the research notes that this positive correlation between prenatal androgen exposure and these specific behaviors exists even when parents actively try to socialize them otherwise, right?
Yes, the biological drive seems to persist despite environmental encouragement toward more traditional female-typed play. And the inverse is also noted in the data. Boys with unusually low levels of prenatal androgen exposure show a tendency to prefer female-typed activities and often choose girls as their primary playmates.
So there is a clear biological hormonal influence at play. But obviously, biology is only one side of the coin. The research emphasizes a bidirectional relationship, meaning we have to look at the environmental and sociocultural influences, particularly how caregivers behave.
The environmental data is just as profound. Parents, and the research specifies that fathers do this more rigidly than mothers, engage in very different parenting practices based entirely on the child's gender.
Right, the socialization aspect.
Yes. Boys are frequently provided with toys that encourage action, competition, and gross motor skills. Think cars, tools, climbing structures.
And girls?
Girls, meanwhile, are disproportionately given toys that encourage nurturance, domesticity, and cooperation, like dolls and kitchen sets. Parents also tend to use more emotion-focused language when speaking to girls.
It's a massive feedback loop. And what happens when these kids take this mix of biology and parental socialization out into the world? The peer group becomes a massive enforcer of these rules.
It leads directly to gender segregation on the playground. beginning around age 3, children show a strong preference for playing with those of their own gender, and they exert intense peer pressure on each other.
They police themselves.
Exactly. By the time they are 5 or 6, they actively enforce these boundaries, believing that gender segregation is the mathematically correct way to behave. You essentially end up with two completely distinct, self-governing cultures existing on the exact same playground.
Though, it is worth noting that culture plays a huge role in how rigid those playground borders are. The data shows that there's significantly more intense gender segregation among preschoolers in North America compared to cultures that place a higher value on group harmony and cooperation.
Right, like in China, Japan, and Korea.
Exactly. So the macro culture of the country trickles all the way down to the sandbox.
It absolutely does. And since we're on the playground, we should look at how sociability and playtime itself evolve. Because knowing how to play with others is a learned skill. No one is born knowing how to share a sandbox.
Right. The research outlines how play emerges in a very specific sequence. First, you have non-social play. This is the toddler just playing alone, completely in their own world.
Just doing their own thing.
Then comes parallel play, where a child plays near other kids using similar toys, but they don't actually try to interact or influence each other. Eventually, they graduate to cooperative play, where they're actually interacting with a shared goal.
A prime example of that advanced cooperative stage is sociodramatic play, which usually kicks in around 3.5 to 4 years old.
Yeah.
This is the classic let's pretend scenario. Kids dressing up as firefighters, playing house, or pretending to run a restaurant together.
Why is pretending to be a firefighter considered such a massive developmental milestone?
Because it requires incredible cognitive gains. To play a role, a child needs a longer attention span. And more importantly, they need an advanced level of what psychologists call theory of mind.
Theory of mind. Think of it like this. It's a child suddenly realizing that just because they know where a hidden toy is doesn't mean their friend knows.
Exactly.
It's the profound realization that other people have totally different brains, thoughts, and secrets. You can't pretend to be a customer in a restaurant if you don't understand that the waiter has a different perspective than you do.
Precisely. It's the birth of true empathy. But cooperative play isn't always so civilized. We also see a lot of rough and tumble play. This is playful fighting, wrestling, chasing, but accompanied by positive emotions and laughter. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, rough and tumble play actually serves a vital, almost counterintuitive developmental purpose. It allows children to practice aggression regulation.
That makes sense. The wrestling, the physical intensity escalates, but the moment someone protests or says, ouch, the play pauses. It teaches them the exact boundaries of physical interaction and how to read physical cues.
Which is critical because early childhood is quite literally the most physically aggressive phase of human life. The research provides very specific trajectories here. Physical aggression actually peaks between 24 and 42 months of age. Think about the terrible 2s and 3s.
Lots of biting, hitting, kicking.
Yeah.
So toddlers are essentially the most violent demographic on Earth.
Statistically speaking, yes. But the good news is that longitudinal analyses show that about 82% of children show low or sharply declining levels of aggression after age 3. They learn to use their words.
Okay, good.
However, the data also shows that about 20% of children maintain moderate to high levels of aggression that continue right into middle childhood.
20% is a huge chunk. What separates the 82% who calm down from the 20% who stay aggressive?
One of the major family environment factors driving that 20% is something researchers call the cycle of coercion. This is a deeply ingrained, toxic pattern of interaction within the home. It usually starts with a parent using threats, harsh criticism, or forceful but inconsistent discipline.
Paint a picture of this for us. What does the cycle of coercion look like in a real-world setting, like a grocery store?
Imagine a tired parent and a toddler in the checkout line. The child grabs a candy bar. The parent makes a harsh demand. Put that back right now or you are in huge trouble.
And the kid pushes back.
The child angrily resists and starts screaming. The parent, who is exhausted and embarrassed by the scene, eventually just sighs and says, fine, just take it, but be quiet. They give in.
So the child learns that escalating the aggression is the winning strategy.
Exactly. The cycle repeats and escalates over time. The tragic outcome is that the child acquires a hostile bias. They develop a distorted view of the world where force is the only way to get needs met.
It really makes you wonder how many highly aggressive adults sitting in corporate boardrooms today simply learned early on that whoever yells the loudest in the cycle of coercion gets their way.
It's entirely possible.
Which perfectly transitions us into how children actually learn right from wrong, because by ages 3 to 4, kids are surprisingly rigid about rules.
They are very rigid. The research states that by this age, children can clearly distinguish between moral rules and social conventional rules. Moral rules are about harm, personal welfare, and individual rights. Things like hitting someone, stealing a toy, or lying. Kids view these as unalterable, universal laws.
Got it.
Social conventional rules, however, are just about social contexts. School rules, the rules of a board game, or saying please and thank you.
And how those foundational moral rules are taught varies wildly depending on where in the world you are raising that child.
It does. The research contrasts families from Taiwan with parents from Europe and North America to highlight this. In Taiwan, moral socialization often focuses on correcting a child's behavior by emphasizing obedience to authority, duty to the family unit, and maintaining social harmony over individual desires.
Whereas parents from Europe and North America take a very different path. They focus heavily on the positive actions of the child after a misdeed has occurred. So strongly encouraging the child to apologize with the ultimate goal of promoting the child's autonomy and protecting their self-esteem.
Right.
It's two completely different cultural pathways to building a moral compass.
And speaking of that moral compass, we have to talk about pro-social behavior. This is empathy, sympathy, and spontaneous helpfulness. By age 2, children display genuine empathy, and by 4 to 5, they will actively try to comfort others who are in distress.
Okay, and here is where I had a massive aha moment reading through the research. You would naturally think that if you want a kid to be more helpful, you reward them. Give them a sticker every time they share a toy or help clean up.
That's what you would assume.
But the data explicitly notes that giving rewards for helping actually undermines their pro-social behavior. Why does paying them to be kind ruin the behavior? That feels completely backward.
It does feel counterintuitive, but it comes down to intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. When a child helps someone spontaneously, they do it because it feels good internally. That's intrinsic motivation.
Right.
When you start giving them stickers or treats for it, you shift it to extrinsic motivation. You turn an act of empathy into a transaction. So when the rewards stop, the behavior stops. They learn not to be kind for free.
So what does this all mean? How do caregivers actually navigate all of this without messing it up? This brings us to a fascinating matrix in the research, outlining 4 distinct parenting styles based on 2 dimensions: how much warmth and responsiveness the parent shows versus how much control and demand they exert.
This matrix is a cornerstone of developmental psychology. The 4 combinations yield very different results. Let's start with high control but low warmth. This is the authoritarian style.
This is the classic my way or the highway approach. Unquestioning obedience. If we go back to our grocery store example, if the kid reaches for the candy, the authoritarian parent snaps, put it back. And if the kid asks why, the answer is, because I said so.
Exactly.
There's no explanation, and the means of control are yelling, commands, and punishment. What does the data say about the kids raised this way?
The outcomes are generally higher levels of anxiety and withdrawal. Or, on the flip side, because they are so suppressed, they can develop intense aggression and defiance when the parent isn't around.
Makes sense.
Now, the exact opposite of that is low control and high warmth. This is the permissive style.
I love you, do whatever your heart desires. In the grocery store, this parent probably buys the candy before the kid even asks, just to keep them happy.
Right.
There is high affection, but absolute zero discipline or boundaries. I'm guessing this doesn't end well either?
It doesn't. The child outcomes here often include a severe lack of self-control, low task persistence, meaning they give up easily when frustrated, and they tend to be highly impulsive. They've never been taught how to handle a no.
And what's the third one?
Third, we have low warmth and low control, the uninvolved style.
In extreme cases, this is flat-out neglect. Parents might meet the basic survival needs, food, shelter, but are otherwise completely detached emotionally and behaviorally.
And, not surprisingly, this leads to the most severe outcomes: low school achievement, psychological maladjustment, and major social skill problems. Finally, we have the gold standard in Western psychology: high warmth and high control, the authoritative style.
Warm, but firm. Back in the grocery store, this parent says, "No, we aren't buying candy today because it's almost dinner time, but you can help me pick out the apples."
Perfect example.
They maintain high expectations but use positive discipline and explain the why behind the rules. And the data shows this style consistently yields independent, cheerful, cooperative children with strong school performance.
This raises an important question, though, and the research is very careful to address it. What works best isn't perfectly uniform across the globe. We have to look at cultural and socioeconomic differences in parenting norms.
Right, because taking the Western authoritative model and applying it everywhere ignores a lot of cultural context.
Precisely. The data notes that highly positive outcomes are actually associated with various combinations of warmth and control if the discipline is culturally normative and the child perceives the relationship as warm.
Can you get an example of that?
For instance, traditional Chinese parents often use a highly directive style. It features moderate warmth and extremely high control, much more controlling than the Western authoritative style. But because it is culturally normative, it is associated with high academic success and minimal behavior problems.
The research also points out the no-nonsense parenting style, often utilized in low-income, urban-dwelling African American families. This style demands immediate, unquestioned obedience to keep children safe in potentially dangerous environments, but it is delivered in a context of extremely high affection and reasoning.
Right.
And again, because it is culturally normative and paired with that deep warmth, it results in better school performance and fewer behavior problems. It's a great reminder that context is everything.
Context is everything.
Yeah.
But there is one area of discipline where the global data is incredibly unified, and that is physical punishment.
Yes, the data on physical discipline is stark. The research notes that at least 52 countries have legally abolished physical punishment altogether, and the driving force behind that legal trend is the psychological data.
How data is very clear.
The use of physical punishment is universally associated with negative outcomes, and there is absolutely zero evidence that spanking is more effective than alternative techniques.
None. In fact, one of the highly effective alternative techniques the research advocates for is called induction. Instead of hitting, an adult uses induction by pointing out the direct effects of the child's misbehavior on others.
Like saying, when you hit your friend, it makes them feel sad and hurts their body.
Yes, it actively encourages empathy and helps the child internalize the moral standard so they eventually behave well, even when no one is watching to punish them.
So, bringing this all together, our mission today was to shortcut your way through this mountain of developmental data. And what we've seen is that early childhood is far more than just kids being kids. It is an incredibly complex, high-wire ecosystem.
It really is.
It's a blend of hardwired biology, immense cultural expectations, and the profound daily modeling provided by caregivers. The ways children learn to regulate their cortisol, the way they choose their playmates based on gender, and how they internalize rules of right and wrong. It all forms the absolute bedrock of their future selves.
Absolutely.
Understanding these childhood roots doesn't just help if you happen to be raising kids. It provides a profound, almost X-ray lens for understanding the behaviors, the biases, and the emotional reactions of the adults you work with, live with, and interact with today.
It really does provide an X-ray lens.
Yeah.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on all this incredible data. If our foundational self-concept, our gender biases, our emotional regulation tools, and our internal rules and morality are so heavily wired into our brains by the time we are just 7 years old, at what point in adulthood do we actually stop operating from our childhood playgrounds and start making truly independent emotional choices?
Wow. That is definitely something to think about the next time you see grown adults arguing over the rules of a game or melting down in traffic. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the roots of human behavior. We hope you learned as much as we did, and we will see you next time.